Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Please, before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight, we delve into one of Florida's most disturbing cases of domestic violence turned deadly. This is the story of Maria Neth, a 31-year-old woman whose life was brutally cut short in a moment of uncontrolled rage. It's a case that exposes the darkest corners of human psychology and the devastating consequences when jealousy and violence collide. Our story takes place in Sunrise, Florida, a quiet suburban city in Broward County. It was here, in an ordinary apartment complex, that an extraordinary act of violence would unfold on a September night in 2015, forever changing the lives of everyone involved. September 20th, 2015, began like many other days for Maria Neth and her boyfriend Fidel Lopez. Maria was 31 years old, a woman trying to rebuild her life after a difficult divorce. She had been married before, but that chapter of her life had closed, and she was attempting to move forward with Lopez, who was 7 years her junior at 24 years old. The couple had been living together in a modest apartment on Northwest 28th Drive in Sunrise. To their neighbors, they seemed like any other young couple, navigating the complexities of modern relationships. Maria worked to support herself, while Lopez struggled to find his place in the world. The relationship, like many, had its ups and downs. But no one could have predicted the horrific events that would unfold that night. As evening approached on that fateful September day, the couple decided to spend their time drinking. They had purchased a bottle of tequila, and what started as a casual evening of drinking would slowly spiral into something much darker. The alcohol flowed freely, and with each drink inhibitions lowered and emotions heightened. By the time night had fully settled over Sunrise, both Maria and Lopez were heavily intoxicated. The tequila had done its work, clouding their judgment and amplifying their emotions. What happened next would be reconstructed through police interviews, forensic evidence, and Lopez's own eventual confession to authorities. According to Lopez's later statements to police, the couple had retreated to their bedroom closet for intimacy. The small enclosed space would become the scene of unimaginable violence. They were engaged in what Lopez described as consensual relations when something triggered an explosion of rage that would cost Maria her life. In that cramped closet, during their most intimate moment, Maria spoke a name, but it wasn't Lopez's name that escaped her lips. It was the name of her ex-husband. According to Lopez's confession, she said it not once, but twice. In his alcohol-fueled state, those two utterances ignited something dark and violent within him. Lopez would later tell investigators that hearing his girlfriend call out another man's name during their intimate moment transformed him into what he called a monster. The jealousy, the humiliation, and perhaps years of pent-up insecurities all collided in that moment, creating a perfect storm of rage that would have devastating consequences. What followed was a brutal attack that defies comprehension. In his fury, Lopez began striking Maria. The confined space of the closet became a chamber of horror as he lost all control. Maria, likely confused and terrified by the sudden turn of events, found herself trapped with a man she no longer recognized. The violence was swift but devastating. Maria lost consciousness from the assault, her body unable to withstand the brutal attack. But for Lopez, the rage hadn't subsided. What he did next would shock even seasoned investigators and become one of the most disturbing crimes in Florida's recent history. What Lopez did to Maria after she lost consciousness goes beyond typical domestic violence into the realm of the incomprehensible. In his statement to police, he described how his anger continued to consume him even after Maria was no longer conscious to defend herself. In a state he described as being possessed by a monster, Lopez committed an act of violence so extreme that it challenges our understanding of human behavior. He violently assaulted Maria's unconscious body in ways that would ultimately cause her death. The details of this assault are so disturbing that they were sealed in court documents, deemed too graphic for public consumption. The medical examiner would later determine that Maria died from the internal injuries inflicted during this assault. Her body had been violated in the most heinous way imaginable, and the brutality of the attack suggested a level of rage that went far beyond momentary anger. As Lopez's fury finally began to subside, he was left alone in the closet with Maria's lifeless body. The woman who had been alive and breathing just moments before was now dead, and the reality of what he had done began to sink in. But instead of immediately calling for help, Lopez's behavior took another disturbing turn. After committing this horrific act, Lopez didn't immediately call for help. Instead, he seems to have spent time trying to process what had happened. The apartment bore signs of his continued rage. There were holes punched in the walls and evidence of destroyed property throughout the residence. It was only after some time had passed that Lopez finally made the decision to call 911. But when he did, he didn't tell the truth about what had happened. Instead, he crafted a story designed to deflect suspicion from himself. At 3:30 a.m. on September 20th, 2015, the 911 dispatch center in Sunrise received a frantic call. On the other end of the line was Lopez, claiming that his girlfriend was having trouble breathing and that he feared she was gonna die. "I don't know, man. She's not breathing," he shouted into the phone, his voice filled with what sounded like panic and desperation. To the dispatcher, it sounded like a medical emergency. Lopez told them that Maria had been feeling ill, that she had gone to the bathroom, and that he had found her in distress. He painted a picture of a concerned boyfriend discovering his girlfriend in medical crisis, not the perpetrator of a brutal murder. Emergency responders raced to the scene, expecting to find a woman in medical distress who might still be saved. Instead, they walked into a scene that would haunt them for years to come. When paramedics and police officers arrived at the apartment on Northwest 28th Drive, they were immediately struck by the scene before them. This was clearly not a medical emergency, as Lopez had described. The apartment showed signs of violence. Furniture was overturned, there were holes in the walls, and blood was visible throughout the residence. But nothing could have prepared them for what they found in the bedroom closet. Maria's body was discovered in a state that shocked even veteran investigators. The brutality of the attack was immediately apparent, and it was clear that this was a homicide of the most extreme nature. The responding officers quickly secured the scene and arrested Lopez. His story about finding Maria in medical distress crumbled immediately when confronted with the physical evidence. The apartment told a story of violence, not illness, and Lopez's demeanor raised immediate red flags with the experienced officers. As crime scene investigators began processing the apartment, they uncovered evidence that painted a clear picture of what had occurred. The closet where Maria's body was found contained biological evidence that supported the story that would eventually emerge. Blood spatter patterns, DNA evidence, and the condition of Maria's body all pointed to a single devastating conclusion. The forensic team worked methodically through the night, documenting every piece of evidence and photographing the scene from multiple angles. Each piece of evidence they collected would later be crucial in building the case against Lopez, and understanding exactly what had happened in those final terrible moments of Maria's life. Detective work began immediately, with investigators from the Sunrise Police Department taking the lead on what was clearly a complex homicide case. The initial challenge was breaking through Lopez's deceptive narrative and getting to the truth of what had happened in that apartment. Lopez was transported to the police station, where experienced detectives began the process of interrogating him. Initially, he stuck to his story about finding Maria in medical distress. He claimed they had been drinking tequila and had engaged in what he described as rough sex, but insisted that Maria had simply become ill afterward. However, the physical evidence at the scene contradicted his story at every turn. The damage to the apartment, the blood evidence, and most importantly, the condition of Maria's body, all pointed to deliberate violence rather than accidental death or medical emergency. The interrogation process was lengthy and challenging. Lopez was clearly attempting to minimize his involvement and present himself as a concerned boyfriend rather than a murderer. But as hours passed and investigators continued to confront him with the physical evidence, cracks began to appear in his story. Detectives used classic interrogation techniques, presenting him with evidence piece by piece and pointing out the inconsistencies in his account. They walked him through the timeline of events, challenging his version at every step. The pressure was methodical and relentless, designed to break through his deceptive narrative and get to the truth. After hours of questioning, Lopez's facade finally crumbled. Faced with overwhelming physical evidence and the persistent questioning of experienced detectives, he finally began to tell the truth about what had happened in that closet. The confession that emerged was shocking in its brutality and honesty. Lopez admitted that he had become enraged when Maria called out her ex-husband's name during their intimate moment. He described the transformation he felt, saying that he had become a monster consumed by jealousy and rage. He detailed how he had attacked Maria in the closet, striking her until she lost consciousness. But most disturbing of all, he confessed to the brutal assault that had ultimately killed her. The details of what he did to Maria's unconscious body were so graphic that they were considered too disturbing for public release. The confession provided investigators with the complete picture of what had occurred that night. It was a crime of passion in the most extreme sense, triggered by jealousy but escalating far beyond anything that could be considered a momentary loss of control. The brutality of the attack suggested a level of rage and violence that went to the very core of Lopez's character. As the confession continued, Lopez seemed to struggle with what he had done. He spoke about loving Maria and claimed that she was the only thing he cared about. The contradiction between these statements and his actions highlighted the complex psychology at work in domestic violence cases. With Lopez's confession in hand, prosecutors began building their case for what would clearly be a first-degree murder charge. The brutality of the crime, combined with the sexual nature of the assault, also led to charges of sexual battery. These were among the most serious charges available under Florida law, and they carried the possibility of the death penalty. Lopez was held without bond as the case moved through the legal system. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His own confession, the physical evidence from the scene, and the medical examiner's findings all painted a clear picture of premeditated murder and sexual assault. The case attracted significant media attention, both locally and nationally. The brutal nature of the crime and the circumstances surrounding it made it a sensational story that captured public attention. However, the graphic details were largely kept from public view out of respect for Maria's memory and her surviving family members. As the legal proceedings continued, Lopez's defense team faced an almost impossible task. The evidence against their client was overwhelming, and his own confession left little room for doubt about his guilt. Their primary goal became avoiding the death penalty for their client. Prosecutors, meanwhile, prepared for what they expected would be a difficult trial. The graphic nature of the evidence would be challenging for jurors to hear, and the case would require careful handling to ensure that justice was served while respecting the dignity of the victim. As the case progressed through the legal system, it became clear that Lopez's defense team was focused primarily on avoiding the death penalty. In Florida, first-degree murder cases with aggravating factors like sexual assault can result in a death sentence, and this case certainly qualified. Negotiations began between the prosecution and defense teams regarding a potential plea agreement. The defense argued that Lopez's immediate confession and cooperation with investigators should be considered as mitigating factors. They painted a picture of a young man who had made a terrible mistake in a moment of alcohol-fueled rage. However, prosecutors were hesitant to accept any plea that didn't reflect the serious nature of the crime. The brutality of Maria's murder and the circumstances surrounding it demanded serious consequences. The victim's family also had to be considered in any plea negotiations. After months of legal maneuvering and negotiation, a plea agreement was finally reached. In July 2017, Lopez agreed to plead guilty to both first-degree murder and sexual battery charges in exchange for a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. This plea would spare him the death penalty, but ensure that he would never again be free. The plea hearing was emotional and difficult for everyone involved. Lopez, speaking through a translator, apologized to Maria's family for his actions. However, his words rang hollow in the face of the devastating crime he had committed. On August 3, 2017, Lopez appeared before Broward County Judge Ilona Holmes for his sentencing hearing. The courtroom was packed with Maria's family members, friends, and members of the media, covering the conclusion of this tragic case. During the hearing, Maria's uncle read a victim impact statement on behalf of the family. The statement described the devastating impact of Maria's death on her loved ones, and the struggle they faced in coming to terms with the brutal nature of her murder. It was a powerful reminder that behind every crime statistic is a real person whose life was cut short and a family left to grieve. Judge Holmes listened to the family statement before addressing Lopez directly. In her comments, she emphasized the brutality of the crime and the devastating impact it had on Maria's family and the community. She noted that while the plea agreement spared Lopez from the death penalty, it ensured that he would spend the rest of his life in prison paying for his crime. The formal sentencing was swift and final. Lopez was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, meaning he would die behind bars for his crime. As he was led away in shackles, the reality of his situation was clear. At just 26 years old, he had thrown away any chance of a normal life. For Maria's family, the sentencing brought a measure of closure, though nothing could bring back their loved one or erase the trauma of her brutal murder. They had to find a way to move forward with their lives while carrying the memory of Maria and the senseless way she died. The case of Maria Neth raises disturbing questions about the psychology of domestic violence and the factors that can lead to such extreme acts of brutality. While domestic violence is unfortunately common, the level of violence displayed in this case goes far beyond typical patterns of abuse. Psychologists and criminologists who have studied similar cases point to several factors that may contribute to such extreme violence. Jealousy, particularly sexual jealousy, has long been recognized as one of the most dangerous emotions in domestic relationships. When combined with alcohol, insecurity, and existing patterns of controlling behavior, it can create a perfect storm for violence. Lopez's claim that he was transformed into a monster reflects a common theme in cases of extreme domestic violence. Perpetrators often described feeling as though they were not in control of their actions, as though they were possessed by some external force. However, this should not be interpreted as an excuse for their behavior, but rather as insight into the psychological state that can lead to such violence. The age difference between Lopez and Maria may have also been a factor. At 24, Lopez was still developing emotionally, and may have been particularly sensitive to perceived rejection or humiliation. The fact that Maria called out her ex-husband's name during their intimate moment likely triggered deep-seated insecurities about his relationship and his own masculinity. Research has shown that domestic violence often escalates over time, with each incident potentially being more severe than the last. However, in this case, there's no clear evidence of prior physical violence between Lopez and Maria. This suggests that the murder may have been an unprecedented explosion of rage, rather than the culmination of an escalating pattern of abuse. The murder of Maria Neth must be understood within the broader context of domestic violence in America. According to statistics from the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, an average of 24 people per minute are victims of rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner in the United States. This translates to more than 12 million women and men each year. What makes Maria's case particularly disturbing is not just the brutality of the violence, but the specific trigger that set it off. The idea that calling out another person's name during intimacy could lead to murder highlights the dangerous intersection of sexual jealousy, masculinity, and violence that exists in our society. Cases like this one also raise important questions about how we identify and intervene in potentially dangerous relationships. If there were warning signs that Lopez was capable of such violence, they weren't apparent to those around the couple. This highlights the challenge of predicting when domestic conflicts might escalate to lethal violence. The role of alcohol in this case also cannot be ignored. While alcohol doesn't cause domestic violence, it can lower inhibitions and escalate conflicts that might otherwise remain nonviolent. The fact that both Lopez and Maria had been drinking heavily that night may have contributed to the tragic outcome. For advocates working to prevent domestic violence, cases like Maria's underscore the importance of education about the warning signs of abusive relationships and the resources available to victims. They also highlight the need for better understanding of the psychological factors that can lead to such extreme violence. In all the focus on the shocking nature of the crime and the legal proceedings that followed, it's important to remember Maria Neth, not just as a victim, but as a person who lived, loved, and had hopes and dreams for her future. She was 31 years old at the time of her death, a woman who had already experienced the challenges of divorce and was trying to build a new life for herself. Those who knew Maria describe her as someone who was working to overcome the difficulties in her past and move forward with optimism. Her relationship with Lopez, while ultimately tragic, may have represented her hope for a fresh start and a chance at happiness after the end of her marriage. The fact that Maria had been married before and was starting over with a younger man speaks to her resilience and willingness to take risks in pursuit of love and happiness. Like many people, she was navigating the complex world of adult relationships and trying to find her place in it. Maria's murder robbed her of any chance to achieve her goals or find the happiness she was seeking. It cut short a life that had already seen its share of challenges but still held promise for the future. Her death serves as a reminder of how quickly domestic conflicts can escalate and how devastating the consequences can be. The impact of Maria's death extended far beyond her immediate family. Friends, co-workers, and even strangers who heard about her case were affected by the brutal nature of her murder. Her story became a cautionary tale about the dangers that can lurk in intimate relationships and the importance of recognizing and addressing warning signs of violence. The case of Maria Neth continues to resonate years after Lopez's conviction and sentencing. For law enforcement officers who worked on the case, it remains one of the most disturbing crimes they've encountered. The brutal nature of the murder and the senseless way Maria's life ended left a lasting impact on everyone involved in the investigation and prosecution. For Maria's family, the pain of her loss continues to this day. While Lopez's life sentence provided some measure of justice, nothing can bring back their loved one or erase the trauma of her brutal murder. They must continue to live with the knowledge of how she died while trying to honor her memory and move forward with their own lives. The case also had an impact on the broader community in Sunrise and the surrounding area. Residents were shocked by the brutality of the crime and the fact that it happened in their quiet suburban neighborhood. It served as a reminder that domestic violence can occur anywhere and can escalate to deadly levels without warning. For domestic violence advocates and educators, Maria's case became another example of the extreme dangers that can exist in intimate relationships. It highlighted the need for better education about the warning signs of potentially violent partners and the resources available to victims of domestic abuse. The case also contributed to ongoing discussions about the role of jealousy and sexual possessiveness in domestic violence. The specific trigger for Lopez's rage, hearing Maria call out another man's name, became a focal point for understanding how certain situations can escalate deadly violence in intimate relationships. As we reflect on the tragic case of Maria Neth, several important lessons emerge that extend far beyond the specifics of this particular crime. First and foremost, the case illustrates how quickly domestic situations can escalate to deadly violence, even in relationships where there may not have been obvious warning signs of abuse. The role of alcohol in escalating domestic conflicts cannot be understated. While alcohol alone doesn't cause violence, it can lower inhibitions and amplify emotions in ways that lead to tragic outcomes. This case serves as a reminder of the dangerous combination of alcohol, jealousy, and intimate relationships. The case also highlights the complex psychology of domestic violence perpetrators. Lopez's description of becoming a monster reflects the way many perpetrators attempt to distance themselves from their actions, as though they were committed by someone else. Understanding this psychology is crucial for developing effective intervention strategies. For potential victims of domestic violence, Maria's case underscores the importance of trusting their instincts and seeking help if they feel unsafe in a relationship. While there's no indication that Maria felt threatened by Lopez before that fatal night, the case reminds us that domestic violence can escalate suddenly and without clear warning signs. The case also demonstrates the importance of thorough police investigations and the value of confession evidence in solving complex crimes. The investigators' persistence in questioning Lopez ultimately led to his confession and ensured that justice was served for Maria's murder. For the legal system, the case represents both a success in terms of achieving a conviction and a challenge in terms of dealing with the extremely graphic nature of the evidence. The decision to accept Lopez's guilty plea in exchange for a life sentence avoided a potentially traumatic trial while still ensuring that he would never be free again. As we conclude this story, we're left with the tragic reality of a life cut short by senseless violence. Maria Neth was just 31 years old when she died, a woman with her whole future ahead of her who became the victim of one of Florida's most brutal domestic homicides. The case of Maria Neth serves as a stark reminder of the deadly potential that exists when jealousy, alcohol, and violence intersect in intimate relationships. In a matter of moments, what should have been a private, intimate encounter between two people became the scene of unimaginable brutality that shocked investigators in the community. Fidel Lopez now sits in a Florida prison, where he will remain for the rest of his natural life. At just 26 years old when he was sentenced, he faces decades of imprisonment ahead of him, paying for the few moments of rage that cost Maria her life and destroyed his own future. His claims of love for Maria ring hollow in the face of the brutal way he ended her life. For Maria's family and friends, the pain of her loss continues, even years after her death. They must live with the knowledge of how she died while trying to honor her memory and find meaning in their own lives. Their victim impact statements at Lopez's sentencing spoke to the devastating and lasting impact of domestic violence on the loved ones of victims. The case also serves as an important reminder for all of us about the warning signs of potentially dangerous relationships and the resources available to victims of domestic violence. While Maria's case may have been difficult to predict or prevent, many domestic violence situations do escalate gradually, providing opportunities for intervention if we know what to look for. As we end tonight's story, we remember Maria Neth not just as a victim of a brutal crime, but as a person who lived, loved, and had hopes for her future. Her life mattered, her dreams mattered, and her memory continues to matter to those who loved her and to all of us who believe that every person deserves to live free from violence. In the quiet suburbs of Sunrise, Florida, life has returned to normal. The apartment where Maria died has new tenants, and the neighborhood has moved on. But for those who knew Maria, and for all of us who have heard her story, the memory of what happened there serves as a permanent reminder of the preciousness of life and the devastating consequences when love turns to violence. Please, if this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to the channel, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next True Crime Stories for Sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight we'll explore a tragic case that shook a college community and led to an international manhunt. This is the story of Haley Anderson, a promising nursing student whose life was cut short in a moment that would forever change those who knew her. The morning light filtered through the windows of Binghamton University's campus on March 9, 2018, casting long shadows across the quiet pathways. Students were beginning their day heading to classes with coffee in hand, notebooks tucked under their arms. It was the kind of ordinary Friday morning that makes you believe the world is predictable and safe. But somewhere in the off-campus housing area of Binghamton, New York, a different kind of morning was unfolding. Friends of 22-year-old Haley Anderson were growing concerned. She hadn't shown up to class the day before, which was completely unlike her. Haley was the kind of person others could set their watches by. Reliable, dedicated, always where she said she would be. Haley Anderson was everything you'd want in a future nurse. Born and raised in Westbury, New York, she possessed that rare combination of academic excellence and genuine compassion. Her friends often joked that she had been born to heal people. Even as a child, she was the one bandaging scraped knees and comforting upset friends. Now in her senior year at Binghamton University, she was just months away from graduating with her nursing degree. Those who knew Haley described her as radiant. Not just in the way she looked, though she was undeniably beautiful with her warm smile and bright eyes, but in the way she moved through the world. She had this energy about her that made others feel better just by being around her. Her roommates often said that coming home to Haley was like stepping into sunshine after a storm. But on this particular Friday morning, that sunshine was nowhere to be found. When Haley's friends realized she was missing, they didn't hesitate to act. This wasn't like her, and they all knew it. In today's world of constant communication, when someone like Haley goes silent, it sends immediate alarm bells through her social circle. They started with the obvious places: her favorite coffee shop, the library where she spent countless hours studying, the campus wellness center where she sometimes worked out between classes. Nothing. No one had seen her since the previous day. Then someone remembered the Find My Friends app. It's one of those modern conveniences we barely think about until it becomes crucial. Haley had location sharing enabled with several of her close friends, a common practice among college students who wanted to look out for each other in a world that could sometimes feel uncertain. When they opened the app, Haley's location showed up as a small blue dot on their phone screens. She was at an off-campus apartment on Oak Street, on Binghamton's west side. The address was familiar to some of them. It belonged to Orlando Tercero, another student they all knew from campus. Orlando was someone who had been part of their extended social circle. He was 22 years old, originally from Miami, but raised in Nicaragua by a well-to-do family. He held dual citizenship, which allowed him to move freely between the United States and Nicaragua. On campus, he was known as a friendly guy, someone who seemed to enjoy the social aspects of college life, perhaps more than the academic ones. What many of Haley's friends knew, but didn't discuss openly, was that Orlando had developed feelings for Haley that went beyond friendship. They had been involved romantically at one point, but Haley had made it clear that she wanted to keep things platonic. She valued his friendship, but wasn't interested in anything deeper. It was a situation that happens all the time in college. Someone wants more, someone else doesn't, and hopefully everyone moves on like mature adults. But as Haley's friends stood outside Orlando's apartment that Friday afternoon, calling her name and getting no response, they began to sense that maybe everyone hadn't moved on. The apartment was eerily quiet. Through the windows, they could see signs of life: furniture, personal belongings, the normal detritus of college living, but no movement, no response to their increasingly frantic knocking. Eventually, they found a way inside. What they discovered would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Haley was there, in Orlando's bedroom, but she wasn't the vibrant, living person they had come looking for. She was lying motionless on his bed, and even from a distance they could tell something was terribly, irreversibly wrong. The scene was jarring in its ordinariness. The room looked like any college guy's bedroom. Slightly messy, posters on the walls, textbooks scattered around. But in the center of it all was this devastating wrongness, this absence where Haley's life should have been. Later, the medical examiner would determine that Haley had died from asphyxiation by manual strangulation. The pathologist, James Turgeon, would find marks on her neck that told a story no one wanted to hear. But in that moment, her friends didn't need medical expertise to understand that something horrible had happened to someone they loved. Orlando was nowhere to be found. When the police arrived, they immediately began treating Haley's death as a homicide. The scene told its own story, and that story pointed directly toward Orlando Tercero. But where was he? Detective Paul Battisti and his team began the methodical work of piecing together what had happened. In cases like this, time is everything. Evidence degrades. Memories fade. And if there's a suspect on the run, every hour that passes makes them harder to find. The security cameras around Binghamton began to tell their story, starting with a camera at Tercero's house that captured him and Haley first entering his apartment on the evening of March 8th. The timestamp showed them walking in together, Haley appearing to go willingly, nothing in her body language suggesting fear or coercion. This detail would become important later, because it painted a picture of trust betrayed. Haley had gone to Orlando's apartment as a friend, believing she was safe with someone she knew. The prosecution would later argue that he possibly strangled her while she was asleep, taking advantage of her vulnerability in the most heinous way possible. But the cameras told another story too, ending with cameras at JFK International Airport. It showed Tercero boarding a plane home to Nicaragua. The timeline was damning. Tercero killed Anderson while she was drunk and therefore defenseless on March 8, 2018, then boarded a plane that same night to Nicaragua. The police also found evidence of Orlando's mental state in the aftermath of the killing. After murdering Haley, he allegedly tried to take his own life by hanging, as the police found a suicide note written in Spanish. He reportedly also purchased melatonin and ZQuil to use them for his suicide attempt. This detail reveals something profound about Orlando's psychological state. He knew immediately what he had done, and he knew it was unforgivable. The suicide note suggested guilt, remorse, and a recognition that his life as he knew it was over. But instead of following through with his suicide attempt, he fled to Nicaragua, where his dual citizenship would complicate any attempts to bring him to justice. Orlando's flight to Nicaragua created a complex legal situation. When he fled there, authorities in the United States worried that he got away with murder. Nicaragua doesn't have an extradition treaty with the United States, which meant that American authorities couldn't simply demand his return. For Haley's family, this was a devastating development. Her mother, Karen Anderson, faced the horrifying possibility that her daughter's killer might never face justice. The man who had taken everything from their family had seemingly escaped to a country where American law couldn't touch him. But sometimes justice finds unexpected paths. Orlando Tercero, 22, was arrested in Nicaragua at a hospital on March 14, 2018. He had wounds to his lip and head that police in that country say were self-inflicted. It appeared that his earlier suicide attempt had been more serious than initially realized, or perhaps the weight of what he had done had driven him to try again. The Nicaraguan authorities, while not bound by extradition treaties, were not prepared to simply let a suspected murderer walk free in their country. They began their own investigation and ultimately decided to prosecute Orlando under Nicaraguan law. This was unprecedented. An American student, killed on American soil, would receive justice in a Nicaraguan courtroom under Nicaraguan law. It wasn't the outcome anyone had expected, but for Haley's family, it was better than no justice at all. Tercero's trial began on October 1, 2019, more than a year and a half after Haley's murder. The proceedings took place in Managua, Nicaragua's capital, in a justice system unfamiliar to most Americans but bound by its own rules of evidence and procedure. The prosecution's case was straightforward. They argued that Orlando had been obsessed with Haley, unable to accept that she wanted to end their romantic involvement while maintaining their friendship. It was their case that he was obsessed with her, and that this obsession had turned deadly when he realized he couldn't have her the way he wanted. The evidence was compelling. There were the security camera footage showing their movements, the timeline of events, the medical examiner's findings, and Orlando's own flight to Nicaragua immediately after the murder. It painted a picture of premeditation, or at least of someone who knew immediately that what he had done was wrong. But Orlando's defense attorney, Eduardo Ruby, had a different strategy. Orlando's defense attorney, Eduardo Ruby, argued that due to the influence of alcohol, Orlando was temporarily insane at the time of Haley Anderson's murder. It was a desperate defense. But sometimes desperate defenses work when reasonable doubt is the standard. And in an effort to prove it, he called a psychiatrist as his first and only witness, Dr. Ronald Lopez Aguilar, who testified about Orlando's mental state and the potential effects of alcohol on his judgment and control. For Karen Anderson, sitting in a foreign courtroom, listening to testimony in a language she didn't fully understand, this defense was particularly painful. Karen Anderson, the only thing I was worried a little bit about was the insanity plea. The thought that her daughter's killer might escape responsibility by claiming temporary insanity was almost unbearable. But the prosecution had their own expert testimony. District Attorney Steve Cornwell, the evidence was overwhelming. You choked her to death. You took Haley, who I believe may have been sleeping, and choked the life out of her and left her there to rot. That is sick. A disturbed man could take advantage of somebody he claimed to love and kill her because he couldn't have her. The brutality of the crime, combined with Orlando's immediate flight to Nicaragua, suggested someone who knew exactly what he was doing, and knew it was wrong. The temporary insanity defense began to look increasingly thin. A month later, he was convicted of femicide. At his sentencing, the Nicaraguan judge handed down the maximum sentence for that crime in the country, 30 years. The term femicide was significant. It recognized that this wasn't just a murder, but a murder specifically motivated by gender-based violence, by a man's inability to accept a woman's autonomy and choices. During the sentencing, the judge told the court that all women have the right to live. It was a simple statement, but it carried profound weight in the context of this case. Haley Anderson had the right to live, the right to choose her own romantic partners, the right to say no. Orlando Tercero had violated that most fundamental right. The 30-year sentence was the maximum allowed under Nicaraguan law, and he also will receive credit for the more than 19 months he has spent waiting for trial at the Directorate of Judicial Assistance, a Nicaraguan prison more commonly referred to as El Chipote. Orlando's legal team attempted to appeal the conviction, but after Tercero's appeal was denied on Tuesday, he was given 10 days to appeal again. The appeals were unsuccessful, and the conviction stood. For Karen Anderson, the sentence brought a measure of closure, though she acknowledged that, unfortunately, I don't even think 30 years is enough. But I appreciate all the work you have done to convict Tercero to the fullest extent of the law. The murder of Haley Anderson sent shockwaves through the Binghamton University community. College is supposed to be a time of growth, discovery, and relative safety. Students trust each other, form friendships, and navigate romantic relationships with the assumption that their peers are fundamentally decent people who won't harm them. Haley's death shattered that assumption for many. It forced conversations about consent, about respecting others' boundaries, about the warning signs of obsessive behavior. It made students more cautious about who they trusted and how they managed their personal safety. Karen Anderson, the victim's mother, said she hopes to honor her daughter by educating college students about these issues. In her grief, she found a way to try to prevent other families from experiencing what hers had endured. The case also highlighted the role of technology in modern crime and justice. The Find My Friends app, which had helped locate Haley's body, became a reminder of how our digital lives interweave with our physical safety. Security cameras, which captured Orlando's movements before and after the murder, provided crucial evidence that might not have existed in earlier eras. As we consider this case, it's important to remember who Haley Anderson was, beyond the circumstances of her death. She was a young woman with dreams and plans, someone who had chosen a career dedicated to helping others heal. Her friends remember her laugh, her kindness, her ability to light up a room. She was somebody's daughter, somebody's best friend, somebody's study partner. She was also someone who had every right to make her own choices about relationships and romance. The fact that she wanted to remain friends with Orlando while not pursuing a romantic relationship was completely reasonable and normal. She owed him nothing more than basic human decency, which she had always shown him. Orlando Tercero's inability to accept her choice, his obsession with having her on his terms rather than respecting her autonomy, ultimately led to tragedy. His case serves as a stark reminder that rejection, even gentle rejection from someone who wants to maintain a friendship, is not a personal attack that justifies violence. The international nature of his prosecution also serves as a reminder that in our interconnected world, justice can sometimes find unexpected paths. While the legal complexities of his case were challenging, the ultimate outcome proved that geographical boundaries don't always provide escape from the consequences of one's actions. Today, Orlando Tercero remains incarcerated in Nicaragua, serving his 30-year sentence for femicide. The conditions in Nicaraguan prisons are harsh, particularly different from what he might have experienced growing up in a well-to-do family. The young man who once walked the corridors of Binghamton University now spends his days in a cell, with decades still ahead of him to contemplate the choices he made on March 8, 2018. Prison records indicate that he has had limited contact with the outside world. His family in Nicaragua has largely distanced themselves from his case, though they reportedly visit occasionally. The weight of what he did seems to have settled on everyone who knew him, forcing them to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the person capable of such violence. For those studying criminal psychology, Orlando's case presents a complex profile. He wasn't someone with a long history of violence or obvious red flags that might have predicted this outcome. He was, by most accounts, a normal college student, right up until the moment he decided to take Haley's life, rather than accept her choice to end their romantic relationship. This ordinariness is perhaps what makes his case so unsettling. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that people capable of extreme violence don't always look like our preconceptions of criminals. They sometimes look like the person sitting next to you in class or the friend of a friend at a party. In the years since her death, Haley's memory has been preserved in various ways. Her family established scholarships in her name to help other aspiring nurses pursue their education. The nursing program at Binghamton University has honored her memory with awards recognizing students who embody her compassion and dedication. Her friends, now graduated and working in various fields, carry her memory with them as they navigate their adult lives. They speak of how her death changed them, made them more aware of personal safety, more careful about trusting others, but also more determined to live fully in honor of the life that was taken too soon. The ripple effects of her death continue to spread. Students at Binghamton University today, many of whom never knew Haley personally, benefit from increased safety measures and awareness programs that were implemented in response to her murder. Her death became a catalyst for positive changes, though everyone wishes those changes hadn't been necessary. Haley's case fits into a broader pattern of gender-based violence that affects college campuses across the country. According to various studies, young women aged 18 to 24 are at particularly high risk for intimate partner violence and stalking behaviors. The college environment, with its social mixing and relative freedom, can sometimes create situations where boundary violations escalate dangerously. What makes Haley's case particularly tragic is that she had tried to handle the situation maturely. She hadn't cut Orlando out of her life completely, hadn't been cruel or dismissive. She had simply tried to maintain a friendship while being clear about her romantic boundaries. In a healthy relationship dynamic, this should have been completely acceptable. Her murder serves as a reminder that women cannot manage their way out of male violence through perfect behavior. No matter how kind, how clear, how reasonable a woman is in setting boundaries, she cannot control how others will respond to those boundaries. This is a lesson that extends far beyond college campuses. In domestic violence situations, in workplace harassment cases, in dating relationships, the responsibility for violence lies entirely with the person who chooses violence, not with the victim who is simply trying to live her life. One of the most striking aspects of this case was the role that modern technology played in both solving the crime and bringing the perpetrator to justice. The Find My Friends app, which might seem like a minor convenience in our daily lives, became the key to finding Haley's body and beginning the investigation. Similarly, the network of security cameras that captured Orlando's movements before and after the murder provided crucial evidence that might not have existed even a decade earlier. These cameras created an electronic trail that was impossible to dispute and provided prosecutors with a clear timeline of events. Even Orlando's flight to Nicaragua was captured on airport security cameras, providing visual evidence of his immediate flight from the scene. In the past, someone fleeing to another country might have simply disappeared into obscurity. Today, the digital footprints we leave make it much harder to truly escape. This technological dimension of the case also raises questions about privacy and surveillance. The same technologies that help solve Haley's murder also track our movements, our purchases, our communications on a daily basis. Most of us accept this trade-off without thinking about it, but cases like Haley's remind us of both the benefits and the costs of living in a surveilled society. As we reflect on this tragic case, it's worth considering what lessons it might offer for preventing similar tragedies in the future. While we can never completely eliminate the risk of violence, there are steps that individuals and institutions can take to reduce that risk. For individuals, Haley's case highlights the importance of trusting your instincts about people. If someone makes you uncomfortable, if they don't seem to respect your boundaries, if they react poorly to rejection, these can be warning signs worth taking seriously. For educational institutions, the case underscores the need for comprehensive education about healthy relationships, consent, and conflict resolution. Many college students are still learning how to navigate adult relationships, and they need guidance about what healthy relationship dynamics look like. The case also highlights the importance of campus safety resources. Students need to know where to turn for help if they feel threatened or unsafe, and they need to trust that those resources will be effective and supportive. Perhaps most importantly, the case reminds us of the need for broader cultural change around how we think about relationships, rejection, and male entitlement. Until we address the underlying attitudes that make some people believe they have a right to another person's romantic attention, we will continue to see tragedies like Haley's. As this story draws to a close, Orlando Tercero continues to serve his sentence in a Nicaraguan prison. He has roughly 28 years remaining on his sentence. Assuming he serves the full term, he will be in his 50s when he is released. An old man paying the price for a choice he made as a young one. Haley Anderson, on the other hand, will be forever 22, forever the bright, compassionate nursing student who wanted to help heal the world, forever the daughter who made her mother proud, the friend who could light up any room, the woman who deserved to make her own choices about love and life. Her story serves as a reminder of the preciousness and fragility of life, of the importance of respecting others' autonomy, and of the devastating consequences that can flow from a moment of violence. It's a story that no one wanted to tell, but one that needs to be remembered, so that perhaps, in some small way, it can help prevent future tragedies. In the quiet moments before sleep, when our minds settle and our thoughts turn inward, Haley's story reminds us to treasure the ordinary moments of safety and connection that make up most of our lives. It reminds us to be grateful for the people who choose kindness over violence, respect over control, love over possession. And it reminds us that every life has infinite value, infinite potential, infinite worth, including our own. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. In the quiet suburbs of Springfield, Illinois, where tree-lined streets whisper stories of American dreams and family aspirations, there once lived a couple who seemed to embody everything their neighbors hoped for in life. Mark and Donna Winger appeared to have it all. Successful careers, a beautiful home, and a love that had weathered the storms of infertility to finally bless them with a precious baby daughter through adoption. But sometimes the most perfect facades hide the darkest secrets. And on August 29th, 1995, the carefully constructed world of Mark Winger would shatter in a way that would fool investigators, devastate families, and leave a community questioning everything they thought they knew about the man they had once considered a hero. Mark Winger was born on November 26, 1962, in Elyria, Ohio, a residential suburb of Cleveland. Raised in a Jewish household alongside an older sibling, Mark seemed destined for success from an early age. He was intelligent, articulate, and possessed the kind of steady reliability that made people trust him instinctively. By the 1990s, Mark had built himself an impressive career as a nuclear technician with the Illinois Department of Nuclear Safety. It was the kind of position that commanded respect, requiring precision, responsibility, and an unwavering attention to detail. These same qualities that made him excellent at his job would later serve him in ways that no one could have imagined. Donna, born in 1963, was Mark's perfect complement. Friends and family described her as vivacious, caring, and deeply committed to their marriage. She had her own professional aspirations and dreams, but like many couples of their generation, she and Mark had spent years focused on building their life together, particularly their dream of becoming parents. The couple had struggled with infertility, a journey that can test even the strongest relationships. But rather than breaking them apart, it seemed to bring Mark and Donna closer together. They made the decision to adopt, and in the months leading up to August 1995, they had welcomed a beautiful baby daughter into their Springfield home. To their neighbors, to their friends, to their families, the Wingers represented everything good about suburban American life. Mark was the devoted husband and father, working hard to provide for his family. Donna was the loving mother, adjusting to life with their new daughter. They lived in a nice neighborhood, attended community events, and seemed genuinely jadify. But beneath this perfect surface, something was brewing. Something that would soon explode into violence in a way that would shock everyone who thought they knew Mark Winger. In the summer of 1995, Donna had an experience that would later become central to one of the most calculated murders in Illinois criminal history. She had occasion to use a shuttle service, the kind of professional transportation that was common for people traveling to and from airports or other destinations when they needed reliable transport. The driver assigned to her that day was Roger Harrington, a 27-year-old man who worked for an airport shuttle company. Roger was described by those who knew him as a generally decent person, though he had some personal struggles. Like many young adults trying to find their place in the world, Roger had faced some challenges in his life, but nothing that marked him as dangerous or violent. During that shuttle ride, something happened that made Donna uncomfortable. The exact nature of what transpired has been the subject of much discussion and investigation. But what's clear is that Donna felt unsettled enough by Roger's behavior or comments that she mentioned the incident to Mark when she got home. In a normal marriage, this might have been a passing conversation, an uncomfortable experience shared between spouses, discussed and then forgotten as life moved on. But Mark Winger was not operating within the bounds of a normal marriage, though no one knew that at the time. In Mark's calculating mind, Donna's uncomfortable experience with Roger Harrington wasn't just an unpleasant incident. It was an opportunity. What Donna didn't realize as she shared her concerns with her husband was that she was handing him the perfect patsy for a murder he was already planning. In Mark's twisted thinking, Roger Harrington had just become the ideal fall guy for what would be one of the most elaborate staged crime scenes in criminal history. August 29th, 1995, started like any other day in the Winger household. Mark went to work at his job with the Illinois Department of Nuclear Safety, carrying out the precise technical work that had earned him respect and trust in his professional community. Donna spent her morning caring for their infant daughter, probably running the small errands and managing the countless details that fill the days of new mothers. But unbeknownst to Donna, Mark had been making preparations. He had been thinking, planning, orchestrating what would become a masterpiece of deception that would fool law enforcement for years to come. Sometime that day, Mark contacted Roger Harrington. The exact pretext for this contact has been a matter of investigation and speculation. But what's clear is that Mark lured Roger to the Winger home. Perhaps he claimed he wanted to discuss Donna's complaints about the shuttle service. Perhaps he suggested there was a business opportunity. Or maybe he simply made up some reason why Roger needed to come to the house. Whatever story Mark told, Roger Harrington drove his maroon Oldsmobile to the Winger residence that evening, parking it in front of their well-maintained suburban home. He walked up to the front door, probably expecting a brief conversation, maybe an apology, possibly even a business discussion. He had no idea he was walking into his own execution. What happened inside the Winger home that evening was brutal, calculated and executed, with the cold precision of someone who had thought through every detail. Mark Winger didn't kill in a moment of passion or during a sudden argument. This was premeditated murder, planned and carried out with methodical efficiency. First, Mark turned on Donna, the woman who had trusted him completely, who had built a life with him, who had just months before become the mother of his adopted daughter. Using a hammer, a tool that would leave devastating, unmistakable injuries, Mark attacked his wife with savage force. Donna was struck in the head no fewer than 7 times. The brutality of the assault was shocking, the kind of violence that speaks to deep rage, or in Mark's case, the cold determination. Ensure his victim could never tell the truth about what really happened. As Donna lay dying, or already dead from these massive head injuries, Mark turned his attention to Roger Harrington. Roger, who had come to the house unsuspecting, who had no reason to expect violence, who was probably completely bewildered by what he was witnessing. Mark shot Roger twice in the head, killing him quickly and efficiently. But Mark's work wasn't finished. In fact, the murders were just the beginning of his performance. Now came the staging, the careful arrangement of the scene that would sell his story to the police, to the community, and to everyone who would investigate what appeared to be a tragic home invasion. Mark positioned the bodies carefully. He arranged Roger's body near Donna's, creating the scene he wanted police to discover. He placed the hammer near Roger, making it look like Roger had been the one wielding it against Donna. Every detail was calculated to support the story he was about to tell. Then, with the cold-blooded composure that would characterize his entire deception, Mark Winger called 911. When police arrived at the Winger home that evening, they found what appeared to be a straightforward if tragic crime scene. Mark met them at the door, shaken and distraught, but coherent enough to tell his story. According to Mark, he had come home to find Roger Harrington attacking his wife with a hammer. Mark claimed he had witnessed Roger kneeling beside Donna, beating her with the weapon in a savage assault, in what he described as an act of desperate defense of his family. Mark said he had grabbed his gun and shot the intruder, but tragically it was too late to save Donna. It was a story that made perfect sense to the responding officers. Here was a devoted husband and father who had walked into every homeowner's worst nightmare, a violent stranger attacking his family in their own home. Mark had acted exactly as any protective husband and father would, using lethal force to stop a brutal assault on his wife. The evidence seemed to support Mark's account. Roger's body was positioned near Donna's, just as Mark described. The hammer was there, just as it would be if Roger had been using it as a weapon. Roger himself was a stranger to the family, with no apparent connection to the Wingers beyond the uncomfortable shuttle incident that had happened earlier. Mark's emotional state seemed entirely appropriate for someone who had just experienced such trauma. He was shaken, grief-stricken, and deeply traumatized by what he claimed to have witnessed and been forced to do. His responses to police questions were consistent, detailed, and delivered with the kind of sincerity that convinced everyone who heard them. The investigation that followed was thorough but brief. Police interviewed neighbors, examined the crime scene, and reviewed Mark's account. Everything checked out. There was no evidence of any problems in the Winger marriage. No indication that Mark had any motive to harm his wife. No reason to suspect that his account of events was anything other than the tragic truth. Within days, the case was considered solved. Roger Harrington was identified as a violent intruder who had attacked Donna Winger in her home and been killed by her husband in justifiable defense of his family. It was tragic, but it was also exactly what it appeared to be, a random act of violence, stopped by a courageous husband and father. In the days and weeks that followed the murders, Mark Winger found himself embraced by his community in ways that must have exceeded even his calculations. The story of what had happened to his family touched the hearts of neighbors, co-workers, and strangers throughout Springfield. Here was a man who had suffered the ultimate tragedy, losing his beloved wife to a violent criminal, but who had shown incredible courage in defending his family. The fact that Mark had been forced to take a life in defense of his wife only added to the sympathy people felt for him. Everyone understood that having to shoot and kill another human being, even in such circumstances, would be a trauma that would stay with Mark forever. The community rallied around Mark and his infant daughter in ways that demonstrated the best of human nature. People brought food, offered childcare, provided emotional support, and made financial contributions to help the small family during their time of grief. Mark received $25,000 from a fund established for crime victims, money that was intended to help him and his daughter rebuild their lives after such devastating loss. Additionally, Mark received a $150,000 life insurance payout following Donna's death. This substantial sum, combined with the community support, meant that Mark was financially secure as he faced the future as a single father. Mark handled his new role as the grieving widower with what appeared to be grace and dignity. He wrote a heartfelt letter to a local newspaper, thanking the community for their overwhelming support during what he described as the most difficult period of his life. The letter was eloquent, humble, and deeply moving, exactly what people would expect from a man who had shown such courage in defending his family. To everyone watching, Mark Winger was a hero who had paid a terrible price for his heroism. He had saved his daughter from witnessing her mother's murder, but he had been forced to take a life to do so. He had acted with courage and decisiveness, but now he had to live with the trauma of what he had experienced and done. The story of Mark Winger became something of a local legend, a reminder that sometimes ordinary people are called upon to do extraordinary things, and that courage can emerge in the darkest moments. It was a story that reinforced people's faith in the fundamental goodness of human nature, and the power of love and protection that drives parents to defend their children at any cost. In the months following the tragedy, Mark began the difficult process of rebuilding his life. As a single father with an infant daughter, he faced challenges that generated continued sympathy and support from his community. Everyone understood that raising a child alone while grieving the loss of a spouse and dealing with the trauma of having killed another human being would be an enormous burden for any person to bear. Less than 6 months after the murders, Mark made a decision that seemed both practical and emotionally healthy. He hired a nanny to help care for his daughter. The woman he chose was Rebecca Simic, someone who could provide the kind of stable, nurturing care that his daughter needed during this difficult time. Rebecca's entry into the Winger household was viewed by everyone as a positive development. Mark needed help, his daughter needed care, and Rebecca seemed like exactly the right person to provide both. She was professional, caring, and understood the unique challenges facing this small family as they worked to heal from their trauma. What no one anticipated was how quickly the relationship between Mark and Rebecca would evolve beyond a professional arrangement. Within a relatively short period, their working relationship had developed into something more personal, more intimate. Mark and Rebecca fell in love, or at least what appeared to be love to everyone watching their relationship develop. To the community that had been following Mark's story, this development seemed both natural and encouraging. Here was a man who had suffered tremendous loss, but who was finding a way to open his heart again. Here was a woman who was not only caring for his daughter, but was bringing love and stability back into his life. It was the kind of happy ending that people hoped for after such tragedy. When Mark and Rebecca married, their wedding was celebrated by everyone who had supported Mark through his darkest days. It seemed like the final chapter in a story of redemption, healing, and the power of love, to overcome even the most devastating trauma. Over the next few years, Mark and Rebecca expanded their family, having 4 children together. Mark seemed to have successfully rebuilt his life, creating a large, loving family that honored Donna's memory while moving forward into a hopeful future. He was a respected member of his community, a devoted father to 5 children, and a husband who had found love again after unimaginable loss. For 4 years, the story of Mark Winger remained exactly what it appeared to be. A tragedy followed by healing, loss followed by love, darkness followed by light. But in 1999, cracks began to appear in this perfect narrative. The first whispers of doubt about Mark Winger's story came not from law enforcement, but from the civil courts. 4 years after the murders, questions were raised in a civil lawsuit that cast doubt on the official version of events from that August evening in 1995. The lawsuit brought forward allegations that seemed almost impossible to believe. That Mark Winger had not been the hero everyone thought he was, but instead had been the perpetrator of both murders. According to these allegations, Mark had not saved his daughter from witnessing her mother's murder. He had been the one who committed that murder in the first place. These accusations were based on the analysis of a blood spatter expert who had reviewed the evidence from the crime scene. Blood spatter analysis is a specialized field of forensic science that examines the patterns of blood at crime scenes to determine how events unfolded. The expert's analysis suggested that the blood patterns at the Winger home were inconsistent with Mark's account of what had happened. In December 1999, the Springfield State Journal-Register ran an article detailing these allegations, bringing them to public attention for the first time. For people who had supported Mark through his tragedy and celebrated his recovery, these accusations were shocking and difficult to believe. How could the man they had embraced as a hero actually be a cold-blooded killer? How could someone who had shown such love for his family have been the one to destroy it? The allegations seemed to contradict everything they knew about Mark Winger and everything they had witnessed over the previous 4 years. But once questions were raised, other inconsistencies began to emerge. Details that had seemed minor or irrelevant in 1995 took on new significance when viewed through the lens of suspicion, rather than sympathy. The public attention generated by the civil lawsuit allegations forced law enforcement to take a fresh look at the Winger case. What had been considered a closed case, a tragic but straightforward home invasion, was now being questioned by forensic experts and legal professionals. When investigators began re-examining the evidence with new eyes, details that had been overlooked or dismissed in the original investigation suddenly became significant. The positioning of the bodies, the pattern of blood spatter, the logistics of how the events would have unfolded according to Mark's story. All of these elements were scrutinized with the kind of careful analysis that might have revealed the truth years earlier. One of the most significant discoveries involved the weapon that Roger Harrington had supposedly left in his car. If Roger had come to the Winger home with the intention of attacking Donna, investigators wondered why had he left obvious weapons in his vehicle. The discovery suggested that Roger had not come to the house prepared for violence, but rather had been lured there under false pretenses. The re-examination also revealed problems with the crime scene itself. Mark had claimed that he found Roger kneeling beside Donna, beating her with a hammer, and that when he shot Roger, the man fell backwards so that his feet remained near Donna's head. But when investigators looked at the actual crime scene photographs, Polaroid images that had been taken the night of the murders, they found that Roger's body was not positioned as Mark had described. These discrepancies might seem minor, but in a murder investigation, details matter. The positioning of bodies, the pattern of blood spatter, the location of weapons. These are the kinds of forensic clues that can reveal the truth about what really happened during violent crimes. As the reinvestigation continued, a picture began to emerge that was completely different from the one that had been accepted for 4 years. Rather than being the hero who had defended his family, Mark Winger was beginning to look like a calculating killer who had committed 2 murders and then constructed an elaborate deception to cover his crimes. The more investigators looked into the case, the more evidence they found that contradicted Mark's story. The forensic analysis that had been superficial in 1995 was now conducted with sophisticated techniques and careful attention to detail that revealed the true sequence of events. The blood spatter patterns showed that Donna had been killed first, beaten to death with a hammer in a prolonged, savage attack. The injuries she sustained, 7 blows to the head, were consistent with domestic violence, not a random attack by a stranger. The force and repetition of the blows suggested personal rage, or in Mark's case, the cold determination to ensure his victim could never survive to tell the truth. Roger Harrington's death, by contrast, appeared to have been quick and efficient. The 2 gunshot wounds to his head were precisely placed, suggesting that he had been executed rather than killed in self-defense during a struggle. The positioning of his body and the lack of defensive wounds indicated that he had been caught completely off guard, probably by someone he had no reason to fear. The forensic evidence painted a picture of calculated murder, not heroic defense. Mark had killed his wife with brutal efficiency, then killed Roger to provide himself with a patsy for the crime. The entire scene had been staged to support the story he had already planned to tell police. But why would Mark Winger want to kill his wife? This question became central to the investigation, as detectives tried to understand the motive behind what appeared to be a carefully planned double murder. The answer, when it emerged, revealed a side of Mark Winger that no one in his community had ever suspected. Behind the facade of the devoted husband and father was a man capable of the coldest calculation, willing to commit murder to achieve his goals. As investigators dug deeper into Mark's life and relationships, they discovered that his marriage to Donna had not been as perfect as it appeared. There were problems beneath the surface, tensions and conflicts that had been hidden from friends and family. More significantly, they found evidence that Mark had been having an affair. The affair itself might not have provided sufficient motive for murder, but it revealed that Mark was not the devoted husband he appeared to be. It showed that he was capable of deception, of leading a double life, of presenting one face to the world while hiding his true nature and actions. When combined with the forensic evidence that contradicted his story, Mark's affair painted a picture of a man who had decided that murder was preferable to divorce. Rather than face the social and financial consequences of ending his marriage, he had chosen to kill his wife and frame an innocent man for her murder. In 2001, more than 6 years after the murders, Mark Winger was arrested and charged with the deaths of Donna Winger and Roger Harrington. The arrest sent shockwaves through the Springfield community, where Mark had been living as a respected family man and where many people still believed he was a hero. For Rebecca, Mark's second wife and the mother of his 4 younger children, the arrest was devastating. The man she had married, the man she had believed was a grieving widower who had shown incredible courage in defending his family, was now accused of being a cold-blooded killer who had murdered his first wife and an innocent young man. The arrest meant that Rebecca had to face the possibility that everything she thought she knew about her husband was a lie. The story of how they had met, with her coming into his life as a nanny to help care for his daughter, after the tragic murder of his wife, took on a completely different meaning. If Mark had actually been the one who committed that murder, for the community that had embraced and supported Mark for years, the arrest was equally shocking. They had to confront the possibility that they had been deceived by someone they had trusted completely. The man they had seen as a symbol of courage and resilience in the face of tragedy might actually have been the perpetrator of that tragedy. But perhaps most heartbreaking of all was the realization of what this meant for Mark and Donna's adopted daughter, now 6 years old, and for the 4 children Mark had with Rebecca. These children would have to grow up with the knowledge that their father was accused of murder, that the story they had been told about their family's history was a lie. Mark Winger's trial began in 2002, 7 years after the murders. The prosecution's case was built on the forensic evidence that contradicted Mark's story, and on the motive they had uncovered: his affair and his desire to eliminate Donna without facing the consequences of divorce. The forensic testimony was particularly damaging to Mark's defense. Blood spatter experts explained to the jury how the patterns at the crime scene proved that events had not unfolded as Mark claimed. The positioning of the bodies, the nature of the injuries, and the logistics of the supposed struggle all contradicted the story that Mark had been telling for 7 years. The prosecution painted a picture of Mark as a calculating killer who had planned the murders carefully and executed them with cold precision. They argued that he had lured Roger Harrington to his home specifically to kill him and use him as a scapegoat for Donna's murder. They presented evidence of his affair, suggesting that he had decided murder was preferable to the social and financial costs of divorce. The defense, naturally, maintained Mark's innocence and argued that the original investigation had been correct. They pointed to the years that had passed since the murders and suggested that the reinvestigation was flawed. They emphasized Mark's character as a devoted father and respected member of the community, asking the jury how such a man could be capable of such crimes. But the evidence against Mark was overwhelming. The forensic analysis was compelling. The contradictions in his story were clear, and the alternative explanation, that he had staged an elaborate murder scene to cover his crimes, made more sense than the random home invasion he had originally claimed. On May 5, 2002, after deliberating for several hours, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on both counts of first-degree murder. Mark Winger, the man who had been hailed as a hero for 7 years, was convicted of murdering both his wife Donna and the innocent man he had framed for her death, Roger Harrington. The verdict was a vindication for investigators who had worked to uncover the truth, and for the families of both victims who had waited years for justice. But it was also a devastating blow to everyone who had believed in Mark's innocence, particularly his second wife Rebecca and their children. Mark Winger was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murders of Donna Winger and Roger Harrington. The sentence reflected the severity of his crimes and the calculating nature of his deception. But Mark's story didn't end with his conviction. In 2005, while already serving his life sentence, Mark was convicted of an additional crime: solicitation of murder. From behind bars, he had allegedly attempted to arrange the murder of a childhood friend who had refused to pay his bail during his trial. This additional conviction revealed that even facing life in prison, Mark continued to demonstrate the same calculating willingness to use violence to solve his problems that had led to the original murders. It suggested that his capacity for manipulation and violence went even deeper than the prosecution had argued during his trial. For Rebecca, who had stood by Mark through his trial, the additional conviction was apparently the final straw. She had maintained her belief in his innocence through years of investigation and prosecution, but the evidence of his continued attempts to orchestrate violence from prison finally convinced her that she had been deceived. The realization that she had been married to a killer, that she had borne 4 children with the man who had murdered his previous wife, was devastating. Rebecca eventually divorced Mark and worked to rebuild her life and protect her children from the legacy of their father's crimes. In 2021, more than 20 years after the murders, Rebecca finally spoke publicly about her experience. Her story revealed the depth of Mark's deception and the devastating impact his crimes had on everyone who had believed in him. In all the focus on Mark Winger's deception and manipulation, it's important to remember the real victims of his crimes: Donna Winger and Roger Harrington, 2 people whose lives were cut short by his calculating violence. Donna was 32 years old when she was murdered, a woman who had just begun to experience the joys of motherhood through the adoption of her daughter. She had dreams and aspirations, people who loved her, and a future that was stolen from her by the man she trusted most in the world. Her death was not the result of a random crime or a moment of passion, but rather the cold calculation of someone who had decided she was expendable. Roger Harrington was 27 years old, a young man who was still finding his way in life, but who deserved the chance to continue that journey. He became a victim not because of anything he had done, but simply because Mark Winger needed a scapegoat for his wife's murder. Roger went to the Winger home that evening expecting a conversation, perhaps even hoping to resolve whatever issues had arisen from his interaction with Donna. Instead, he walked into his own execution. The tragedy of both deaths is compounded by the years of deception that followed. For 7 years, Donna was remembered as the victim of a random crime, while Roger was vilified as her killer. The truth of their deaths was hidden behind Mark's lies, meaning that neither victim received the justice they deserved until years after their others. Today, Donna and Roger are remembered not as the victim and perpetrator of a random crime, but as the dual victims of a calculating killer who destroyed their lives to serve his own twisted purposes. Their deaths serve as a reminder of how domestic violence can hide behind facades of respectability, and how the most dangerous perpetrators are often those who appear most trustworthy to the outside world. The case of Mark Winger offers several important lessons about the nature of domestic violence, the importance of thorough criminal investigation, and the devastating impact that skilled manipulation can have on entire communities. First, the case demonstrates how domestic violence can be hidden behind carefully constructed facades of respectability. Mark Winger appeared to everyone around him to be an ideal husband and father, successful, devoted, and loving. This appearance allowed him to commit murder and avoid suspicion for years, precisely because no one could imagine that such a good man could be capable of such violence. The case also highlights the critical importance of thorough forensic investigation in murder cases. The original investigation in 1995 was hampered by assumptions and by the compelling nature of Mark's story. When investigators took his account at face value and failed to conduct detailed forensic analysis, they missed evidence that would have revealed the truth immediately. It was only when the case was re-examined years later, with sophisticated forensic techniques and careful attention to physical evidence, that the truth emerged. This underscores how important it is for investigators to follow the evidence rather than accepting the most obvious or compelling explanation for violent crimes. Perhaps most significantly, the case reveals the devastating impact that skilled manipulators can have, not just on their immediate victims, but on entire communities. Mark Winger didn't just kill his wife and Roger Harrington, he also betrayed the trust of everyone who supported him, believed in him, and celebrated what they thought was his heroism. The people who contributed to victim funds, who provided emotional support, who embraced Mark as a symbol of courage and resilience. All of these people were victimized by his deception. Their compassion and generosity were exploited by someone who used their good nature to hide his crimes. For Rebecca and the children, the impact was even more devastating. Rebecca had to face the realization that her entire relationship with Mark had been built on lies, that the man she loved and trusted had been a killer all along. The children had to grow up with the knowledge that their father was a murderer, that the family story they had been told was a fabrication designed to hide horrible crimes. The Winger case created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of taking appearances at face value and the importance of maintaining healthy skepticism, even when dealing with seemingly trustworthy individuals. For law enforcement, the case highlighted the need for thorough forensic investigation, and the dangers of closing cases too quickly, based on compelling but unverified accounts from potential suspects. The techniques that eventually revealed the truth about Mark's crimes were available in 1995, but they weren't used because investigators were satisfied with the obvious explanation for the murders. For the community of Springfield, the case was a harsh reminder that evil can hide behind the most respectable facades. People who had opened their hearts and wallets to support what they believed was a grieving family had to confront the fact that they had been deceived by a calculating killer. The case also had broader implications for how domestic violence is understood and investigated. Mark Winger's ability to hide his true nature for so long, to appear as the perfect husband while planning and executing his wife's murder, demonstrates how skilled abusers can be at manipulation and deception. The fact that it took 7 years for the truth to emerge shows how difficult it can be to see through carefully constructed lies, especially when those lies are told by people who appear trustworthy and respectable. As we reach the end of this story, we're left with the sobering reminder that the most dangerous people are often those who appear most harmless. Mark Winger spent 7 years being celebrated as a hero, while the truth of his crimes remained hidden beneath a carefully constructed facade of grief and respectability. The murders of Donna Winger and Roger Harrington were not random acts of violence or crimes of passion. They were calculated killings carried out by someone who believed he could manipulate the system, deceive his community, and literally get away with murder. For 7 years, he was right. His deception was so complete, his performance so convincing, that he not only avoided suspicion but was actually celebrated for what people believed was his courage in defending his family. It was only through the persistence of investigators who refused to let inconsistencies go unexamined, and through advances in forensic science that revealed the truth hidden in blood patterns and crime scene evidence, that Mark Winger's carefully constructed lies finally crumbled. Today, Mark Winger sits in prison, serving life without parole for the murders he committed and the lives he destroyed. His story serves as a reminder that justice, though sometimes delayed, can ultimately prevail when dedicated investigators refuse to accept easy answers and continue to seek the truth. The case stands as a testament to the victims. Donna, who trusted the wrong person completely, and Roger, who walked innocently into a trap that cost him his life. Their memories are no longer overshadowed by lies and deception, but honored with the truth about how they died and who was responsible for their deaths. And perhaps most importantly, the story reminds us to look beyond surfaces, to question assumptions, and to remember that the most perfect facades sometimes hide the darkest secrets. In the quiet suburbs where we all seek safety and peace, it's worth remembering that danger can come from the most unexpected sources, sometimes from the very people we trust the most. The tree-lined streets of Springfield look the same as they did in 1995, but the community that embraced Mark Winger as a hero learned a hard lesson about the masks that evil can wear. It's a lesson worth remembering, because somewhere tonight, in some quiet neighborhood, someone else might be constructing their own perfect facade while planning their own terrible crimes. The truth, as we've learned from this case, has a way of eventually coming to light. But by then, too often, it's already too late for the victims whose lives were destroyed by those who thought they could hide in plain sight forever. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. In the quiet suburbs of St. Johns County, Florida, where Spanish moss drapes over oak trees and suburban neighborhoods blend seamlessly into natural landscapes, the spring of 2021 seemed like any other. Children rode their bikes down tree-lined streets. Families gathered for weekend barbecues, and teenagers counted down the days until summer vacation. But on one fateful night in May, this peaceful community would be forever changed by an act of violence, so shocking, so inexplicable, that it would shake the very foundation of how neighbors viewed the safety of their own homes. This is the story of Tristan Bailey, a 13-year-old girl whose life was cut tragically short, and the investigation that would reveal the dark truth behind her disappearance on Mother's Day weekend. Tristan Bailey was born far from the Florida suburbs where her story would end. She came into the world in Singapore, where her family was stationed due to her father's military service. From her earliest days, Tristan was described by those who knew her as a ray of sunshine, a girl who possessed an infectious laugh and a smile that could light up any room she entered. When the Bailey family eventually settled in St. Johns County, Florida, Tristan quickly adapted to life in the American South. She enrolled at Patriot Oaks Academy, a school known for its strong sense of community and academic excellence. There, she threw herself into cheerleading with the same enthusiasm she brought to everything in her life. Her teammates would later remember her as someone who was always encouraging others, always ready with a kind word or a helping hand during difficult routines. At 13, Tristan was navigating the complex world of teenage friendships and social dynamics that every middle schooler faces. She had her close circle of friends, participated in school activities, and like many teens her age, was beginning to explore the independence that comes with growing up. Her family described her as responsible and trustworthy, the kind of daughter who would always let them know where she was going and when she would be home. The Bailey household was a typical American family scene. Tristan's parents worked hard to provide for their children, and they had established the kind of close-knit family bonds that many strive for. Sunday family dinners, attendance at Tristan's cheerleading competitions, and the everyday rhythms of homework help and bedtime stories created the backdrop of a life that seemed perfectly ordinary and beautifully normal. But in suburban America, normalcy can sometimes mask darkness that lurks just beneath the surface. In the same school halls where Tristan practiced her cheers and laughed with friends, Another student was harboring thoughts that would soon tear apart the very fabric of their community. Aiden Fucci was also 14 years old when he entered Tristan Bailey's orbit at Patriot Oaks Academy. To outward appearances, he seemed like many teenage boys, quiet, perhaps a bit moody, navigating the awkward transition from childhood to adolescence. He lived with his family in the same general area as Tristan, part of the same suburban landscape of manicured lawns and two-story homes. But those who knew Aiden well began to notice concerning patterns in his behavior. There were whispers among classmates about his fascination with violence, his tendency toward disturbing jokes, and what some would later describe as a troubling preoccupation with death and harm. These were the kinds of warning signs that, in retrospect, would seem like glaring red flags, but at the time were perhaps dismissed as typical teenage rebelliousness or attention-seeking behavior. Aiden's social media presence would later reveal a deeper, more disturbing picture. Posts and messages that spoke to violent fantasies, images that celebrated death and brutality, and interactions that showed a young mind increasingly drawn to darkness. Yet in the halls of Patriot Oaks Academy, he remained largely under the radar. Not popular, but not particularly notorious either. The intersection of Tristan and Aiden's lives was unremarkable at first. They shared classes, moved in overlapping social circles, and knew each other the way most students in a medium-sized school know their classmates. Familiar faces in the hallways, names attached to faces, the casual interactions that make up the daily social fabric of teenage life. What none of Tristan's friends or family could have known was that in Aiden's mind, dark fantasies were taking root. Later investigation would reveal that he had spoken to others about wanting to kill someone, about his curiosity regarding what it would feel like to take a human life. These were not casual comments or teenage bravado. They were the early warning signs of a mind that was moving steadily toward an unthinkable act. Saturday, May 8th, 2021 began like countless other weekend evenings for teenagers in St. Johns County. School was out, summer was approaching, and the warm Florida evening invited outdoor gatherings and socializing. A group of teens had gathered at a friend's house in the Durbin Crossing neighborhood. One of those informal parties that happen when parents are away and word spreads through text messages and social media. Tristan Bailey was among the teenagers who made their way to this gathering. She had gotten permission to go out with friends, the kind of normal teenage social activity that parents gradually allow as their children demonstrate responsibility and trustworthiness. The evening was filled with the typical activities of teenage socializing: music, conversation, laughter, and the kind of bonding that happens when young people feel free to be themselves, away from adult supervision. Aiden Fucci was also at this gathering. Witnesses would later recount that he seemed to be in a particularly dark mood that evening, making comments that struck some as disturbing, though not alarming enough to cause anyone to intervene. The party continued late into the evening, with teens coming and going, some walking home, others getting rides from parents or older siblings. As the night wore on and the gathering began to wind down, something shifted in the dynamic. Around 1:10 a.m. on May 9th, Tristan and Aiden left the house together. This was captured on surveillance footage from the area, two teenagers walking side by side into the darkness, their shadows disappearing down the suburban street. It would be the last time Tristan Bailey would be seen alive by anyone other than her killer. What happened during the next 2 hours would become the subject of intense investigation and courtroom testimony. Aiden would later give multiple, contradictory accounts of their time together. Initially, he claimed they had walked only a short distance together before parting ways, each heading to their respective homes. But as the investigation deepened and evidence mounted, it became clear that this version of events was a carefully constructed lie. The truth was far more sinister. According to evidence that would later emerge, Aiden had lured Tristan to a wooded area near a retention pond in their neighborhood. What began as what Tristan may have believed was a friendly walk with a classmate turned into something unimaginable. In those dark early morning hours, while most of their neighbors slept peacefully in their beds, Aiden Fucci committed an act of violence so brutal and senseless that it would shock even experienced investigators. Sunday morning, May 9th, 2021. Mother's Day dawned bright and clear in St. Johns County. In homes throughout the community, families were preparing for the traditional celebrations that marked this special day. There would be brunches, flowers, handmade cards, and the expressions of love and gratitude that children give to the women who raised them. But in the Bailey household, morning brought not celebration, but growing concern. Tristan had not returned home from her evening out, and she was not answering her phone. For parents of teenagers, this scenario exists in that space between normal worry and genuine panic. Teens sometimes lose track of time, phones die or get left behind, and what seems alarming to parents often has a simple, innocent explanation. However, this was not typical behavior for Tristan. She was responsible about checking in with her parents, and had never stayed out all night without permission. As the morning hours passed and still no word came, the Bailey family's concern escalated from worry to real fear. Around 10 a.m., after exhausting other possibilities and unable to locate their daughter, the Bailey family made the call that every parent dreads making. They contacted the St. Johns County Sheriff's Office to report Tristan as missing. What began as a missing person case would soon transform into something far more tragic. The initial response followed standard protocols for missing teenager cases. Deputies began by interviewing family members, trying to establish a timeline of Tristan's movements and identify anyone who might have information about her whereabouts. They contacted friends who had been at the party, hoping to piece together the events of the previous evening. As investigators worked to trace Tristan's steps, they began to uncover the surveillance footage that would prove crucial to understanding what had happened. The cameras that dotted the suburban neighborhood, security systems on homes, traffic cameras, business surveillance, began to tell a story. The footage showed Tristan and Aiden leaving the party together, walking through the neighborhood in the early morning hours. Word of Tristan's disappearance spread quickly through the tight-knit community. Social media buzzed with concerns and calls for information. Neighbors organized search parties, combing through the wooded areas and retention ponds that were scattered throughout their development. The kind of community response that emerges in times of crisis began to mobilize. People who had never met the Bailey family joined the search, united by the shared fear that something terrible had happened to one of their doe. As search efforts intensified throughout the day on Mother's Day, volunteers and law enforcement officers methodically worked their way through the areas where Tristan might have traveled. The neighborhood where she was last seen was a typical suburban development, a mixture of homes, common areas, small patches of preserved woodland, and the retention ponds that are common features in Florida developments. It was in one of these wooded areas, near a retention pond and not far from where the surveillance cameras had last captured Tristan and Aiden walking together, that a searcher made the discovery that everyone had hoped they would not find. Hidden among the trees and undergrowth, partially concealed but not completely hidden, was Tristan Bailey's body. The scene that investigators encountered was shocking in its brutality. The medical examiner would later determine that Tristan had suffered 114 stab wounds, a number so staggering that it spoke to a level of violence that went far beyond what would be necessary to cause death. This was not a crime of passion that escalated quickly and ended. This was a sustained, brutal attack that demonstrated a level of cruelty that defied comprehension. The forensic evidence painted a picture of Tristan's final moments that was both heartbreaking and horrifying. The defensive wounds on her hands and arms showed that she had fought desperately for her life, trying to protect herself from the relentless attack. The location and pattern of the wounds suggested that her attacker had continued the assault long after it was clear that she could not survive. News of the discovery sent shockwaves through the community. What had begun as a missing person case with the hope of a safe return had become a murder investigation. The reality that one of their own children had been killed, and killed in such a brutal manner, shattered the sense of security the residents of this quiet suburban community had taken for granted. For the Bailey family, the confirmation of their worst fears marked the beginning of a grief that would be compounded by the long legal process ahead. Not only had they lost their daughter, but they had lost her to violence so senseless and cruel that it challenged their understanding of how such evil could exist in their world. With Tristan's body discovered and the case officially classified as a homicide, the St. Johns County Sheriff's Office launched a full-scale murder investigation. The evidence collection at the scene was extensive and methodical, with forensic technicians documenting every detail that might provide clues to the identity of the killer. The surveillance footage that had tracked Tristan and Aiden's movements became even more crucial. Investigators could see clearly that the two teenagers had left the party together, and that only one of them had returned home that night. The timeline was becoming clear. Tristan had left the party with Aiden around 1:10 a.m., and Aiden had returned to his home around 3:30 a.m. alone. But the investigation went beyond just the timeline. Forensic evidence at the scene began to paint a picture of what had occurred during those missing hours. DNA evidence, blood spatter analysis, and the recovery of physical evidence would all play crucial roles in building the case against Tristan's killer. One of the most chilling pieces of evidence discovered was writing found on Tristan's body, words that had been written on her arm, seemingly by her attacker. The content of this writing was so disturbing that investigators initially withheld details from the public, understanding that such information would be deeply traumatic for the victim's family and the community at large. Meanwhile, Aiden Fucci found himself at the center of the investigation. As the last person seen with Tristan alive, he was brought in for questioning. Initially, he maintained his story that he and Tristan had walked only a short distance together before parting ways. He claimed to have gone straight home and suggested that perhaps Tristan had encountered someone else after they separated. But Aiden's story began to unravel under scrutiny. The surveillance footage contradicted his claims about where they had walked and how long they had been together. Physical evidence linked him to the crime scene, and perhaps most damning of all, investigators began to uncover evidence of Aiden's previous statements about wanting to kill someone. Statements that had been dismissed by those who heard them as teenage bravado, but now took on a sinister significance. The investigation also revealed disturbing social media activity on Aiden's accounts. Posts and messages that glorified violence, celebrated death, and demonstrated a fascination with murder became part of the evidence that investigators were building. This digital footprint helped establish not just opportunity but also motive, or at least the mindset that could lead to such a senseless act of violence. On Monday, May 10th, 2021, just one day after Tristan's body was discovered, the St. Johns County Sheriff's Office made an arrest in the case. Aiden Fucci, the 14-year-old classmate who had been the last person seen with Tristan alive, was taken into custody and charged with second-degree murder. The arrest brought some measure of relief to a community that had been gripped by fear and uncertainty. Parents who had been afraid to let their children out of their sight could breathe a little easier knowing that the suspected killer was in custody. But it also brought new questions and new horrors as details of the case began to emerge. The fact that the accused killer was himself just a child, only 14 years old, added another layer of tragedy to an already devastating case. This was not a stranger who had preyed upon their community from the outside. This was one of their own children who had committed an act of unimaginable violence against a classmate. The arrest also marked the beginning of a complex legal process. Because of Aiden's age, there were immediate questions about whether he would be tried as a juvenile or as an adult. The brutality of the crime, the premeditation that the evidence seemed to suggest, and the impact on the community all weighed in favor of adult prosecution. But the legal system would need to work through these issues methodically. For the Bailey family, the arrest provided some answers, but could not begin to heal their wounds. They now knew who had killed their daughter, but the why remained incomprehensible. How could someone so young commit such an act? What had driven Aiden Fucci to take the life of a classmate who had trusted him enough to walk with him in the early morning darkness? The community struggled with similar questions. Parents looked at their own teenagers and wondered how they could protect them from threats they had never imagined. Teachers and school administrators grappled with whether there had been warning signs they had missed, opportunities for intervention that had been overlooked. As the case moved through the legal system, the decision was made to try Aiden Fucci as an adult, despite his young age. The severity and brutality of the crime, combined with evidence of premeditation, convinced prosecutors that adult prosecution was appropriate. This meant that Aiden could potentially face life in prison if convicted. The grand jury proceedings that followed resulted in Aiden being indicted on charges of first-degree murder. The elevation from second-degree to first-degree murder reflected the prosecutor's belief that they could prove premeditation, that this was not a crime of passion or a spontaneous act of violence, but something that Aiden had planned and intended to carry out. As the case prepared for trial, more disturbing details continued to emerge. Investigators revealed that Aiden had previously made statements to other people about wanting to kill someone, about his curiosity regarding what it would feel like to take a human life. These statements, which had been made in the weeks and months leading up to Tristan's murder, provided crucial evidence of premeditation. The forensic evidence also painted an increasingly clear picture of what had happened that night. The 11-114 stab wounds that Tristan had suffered were not randomly distributed. They showed a pattern that suggested sustained, deliberate violence. The defensive wounds on her hands and arms told the story of a young girl who had fought desperately for her life against an attacker who was determined to kill her. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the evidence that suggested the attack had continued long after Tristan would have been unable to defend herself. The sheer number of wounds and the locations where they were inflicted indicated that this was not just murder, but torture. A level of cruelty that shocked even experienced investigators and prosecutors. The Bailey family, while grateful that their daughter's killer would face justice, struggled with the ongoing trauma of having the details of Tristan's final moments constantly revisited in legal proceedings. Each court hearing, each piece of evidence released, each news story about the case forced them to relive the horror of their loss. As the case moved toward trial in early 2023, with jury selection about to begin, an unexpected development changed everything. On February 6, 2023, just before the trial was set to start, Aiden Fucci made the decision to change his plea. In court, he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, acknowledging his responsibility for Tristan Bailey's death. The plea meant that there would be no trial, no lengthy court proceedings where every detail of the crime would be examined and re-examined. For the Bailey family, this was both a relief and a frustration. They were spared the trauma of a trial, but they would never get the full accounting of what had happened to their daughter that they might have received through the trial process. Aiden's confession, however, did provide some details about the crime. He admitted to luring Tristan to the wooded area where she was killed, and he acknowledged the brutal nature of the attack. While his confession did not provide a clear motive, there may never be an explanation that makes sense of such senseless violence. It did confirm what investigators had suspected about the premeditated nature of the crime. The guilty plea set the stage for the final phase of the legal process: sentencing. Even with the guilty plea, there were still questions about what penalty Aiden would face. While first-degree murder carried the possibility of life in prison, his age at the time of the crime and other factors would all be considered by the judge in determining the appropriate sentence. The confession also brought some measure of closure to the community that had been traumatized by Tristan's murder. The acknowledgement of guilt meant that there was no longer any question about what had happened or who was responsible. The community could begin to focus on healing rather than on the uncertainty that comes with a pending trial. For investigators who had worked tirelessly to build the case against Aiden, the confession validated their efforts and confirmed that their evidence and conclusions had been correct. The St. Johns County Sheriff's Office had conducted a thorough, professional investigation that had built an overwhelming case against the accused killer. On March 24, 2023, Aiden Fucci appeared in court for his sentencing hearing. Now 16 years old, he faced the judge who would determine how he would spend the rest of his life. The courtroom was packed with members of the Bailey family, community members, and media representatives who had followed the case since Tristan's disappearance nearly 2 years earlier. The sentencing hearing provided an opportunity for Tristan's family to address the court and to speak about the impact that her murder had had on their lives. Their victim impact statements painted a picture of a family destroyed by grief, of parents who would never again see their daughters smile or hear her laugh. They spoke of the hole that had been torn in their family, a wound that would never fully heal. Family members described Tristan as a light in their lives, a girl who brought joy and energy to everyone around her. They spoke of missed milestones, birthdays that would never be celebrated, a high school graduation that would never happen, a future full of possibilities that had been stolen from her. The impact on her siblings, her extended family, and her friends was immeasurable. The judge, after considering all the evidence and the impact statements, imposed the maximum sentence allowed under law. Aiden Fucci was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of review after 25 years of incarceration. At 16 years old, he would spend at least the next quarter century behind bars, and quite possibly the rest of his life. The sentence brought some measure of justice for Tristan Bailey, though nothing could truly balance the scales after such a senseless loss of life. For the Bailey family, the conclusion of the legal proceedings meant that they could finally begin to focus on healing and on preserving Tristan's memory, rather than on the pursuit of justice. The case also prompted broader conversations about juvenile violence, about warning signs that might be missed, and about how communities can better protect their children from threats they never imagined. The fact that both the victim and the perpetrator were so young forced difficult questions about the nature of evil, and whether it can emerge in people who have barely begun to live their lives. In the months following Aiden Fucci's sentencing, the community of St. Johns County began the long process of healing from the trauma of Tristan Bailey's murder. The case had shaken residents' fundamental assumptions about safety and security, forcing them to confront the reality that violence could emerge from within their own community, perpetrated by one of their own children. Schools throughout the district implemented new programs focused on identifying warning signs of violent behavior and providing resources for students who might be struggling with mental health issues. The goal was not just to prevent another tragedy like Tristan's murder, but to create environments where troubled young people could get help before their problems escalated to violence. The Bailey family established a foundation in Tristan's memory, focused on supporting youth cheerleading programs and promoting the kind of positive activities that had brought joy to their daughter's life. The foundation served both as a way to honor Tristan's memory and as a channel for the family's grief, allowing them to turn their loss into something that could benefit other young people. Community members struggled with how to process the fact that someone so young could commit such a brutal crime. Parents looked at their own teenagers with new eyes, wondering if they truly knew what was going on in their children's minds. The case served as a stark reminder that adolescence, far from being a time of innocent experimentation, can be a period when serious psychological problems first emerge. Mental health professionals who studied the case pointed to the importance of taking seriously any statements that young people make about violence, even when they might seem like typical teenage bravado or attention-seeking behavior. Aiden's previous comments about wanting to kill someone, which had been dismissed by those who heard them, were retrospectively recognized as genuine warning signs that should have prompted intervention. The case also raised questions about the role of social media and violent content in shaping young minds. Aiden's online activity, which included posts glorifying violence and death, became part of the evidence against him, but it also highlighted how easily troubled young people can find and consume content that reinforces their darkest impulses. For the Bailey family, the conclusion of the legal proceedings marked not an end, but a transition to a different phase of their grief journey. Without the demands of court hearings, evidence reviews, and legal consultations to occupy their time and energy, they faced the full reality of their loss in a way that the busyness of seeking justice had temporarily masked. Tristan's parents found themselves navigating the impossible task of rebuilding their lives around the absence of their daughter. The house that had once been filled with the sounds of cheerleading practice, teenage laughter, and the constant activity of a busy family became a quieter place, marked by the presence of memories rather than the energy of a living child. Her siblings struggled with their own grief, while also dealing with the unwanted attention that came with being survivors of such a high-profile tragedy. They had lost not just their sister, but also their sense of normalcy and privacy. Every milestone in their own lives would forever be marked by Tristan's absence. Graduations she would never attend, weddings where she would never serve as a bridesmaid, children she would never meet. The Bailey family made the decision to remain in their community, despite the painful memories associated with the place where their daughter had been killed. They found strength in the support of neighbors and friends who had rallied around them during the darkest period of their lives. The community that had been the site of their greatest tragedy also became the source of their greatest support. They also found purpose in advocacy work, speaking to other parents and communities about the importance of taking warning signs seriously and the need for better mental health resources for young people. Their message was not one of blame or anger, but of education and prevention. The desire to ensure that no other family would have to endure what they had experienced. The foundation they established in Tristan's memory became a central focus of their efforts to honor her life. Through scholarships for young cheerleaders, support for youth sports programs, and advocacy for child safety, they found ways to channel their grief into positive action that would benefit other young people. As time passed and the immediate shock of Tristan Bailey's murder began to fade from daily headlines, the case continued to resonate with those who studied juvenile violence and community safety. Researchers and law enforcement professionals analyzed the case for lessons that might help prevent similar tragedies in the future. One of the key findings was the importance of creating environments where concerning statements made by young people are taken seriously and reported to appropriate authorities. Aiden's previous comments about wanting to kill someone had been heard by multiple people, but no one had understood them as genuine threats worthy of intervention. The case highlighted the need for better education about recognizing and responding to warning signs of violence. The role of mental health services in schools and communities also came under scrutiny. While not every young person who makes disturbing comments will go on to commit violence, the case demonstrated the importance of having robust systems in place to evaluate and treat young people who may be struggling with violent thoughts or impulses. The investigation also revealed the sophisticated nature of the forensic work that had been necessary to build the case against Aiden. DNA evidence, digital forensics, surveillance footage analysis, and traditional detective work had all played crucial roles in establishing his guilt. The case became a model for how modern law enforcement techniques could be applied to solve complex crimes involving juvenile perpetrators. However, many questions remained unanswered. Despite Aiden's confession, a clear motive for the murder was never established. Why had he chosen Tristan as his victim? What had driven him to commit such a brutal act against someone who had trusted him enough to walk with him that night? The absence of a comprehensible motive made the crime even more disturbing for those trying to understand how such violence could emerge. The case also raised broader questions about the nature of evil and whether it can be predicted or prevented. Aiden had been a student in the same school system as his victim, had grown up in the same community, had been subject to many of the same influences and opportunities. What had gone wrong in his development that had led him down such a dark path? The murder of Tristan Bailey sent ripples far beyond the borders of St. Johns County, Florida. The case garnered national attention, partly because of the age of both the victim and the perpetrator, and partly because of the shocking brutality of the crime. News outlets across the country covered the story, and it became a frequent topic of discussion on social media platforms and true crime forums. For other communities, the case served as a wake-up call about the potential for violence to emerge from unexpected sources. Parents in suburban neighborhoods similar to the one where Tristan was killed found themselves having difficult conversations with their children about safety and about the importance of recognizing and reporting concerning behavior. Schools across the country used the case as an opportunity to review their own policies and procedures for identifying and addressing students who might be at risk of committing violence. The case highlighted the challenges that educators face in distinguishing between normal teenage rebelliousness and genuine threats to safety. Mental health professionals noted that the case illustrated many of the warning signs that research has identified as potentially predictive of violent behavior. Fascination with violence, statements about wanting to hurt others, social media activity glorifying death and brutality, an apparent lack of empathy for others. However, they also acknowledged the difficulty of translating these warning signs into threat prevention strategies. The legal system's handling of the case, particularly the decision to try Aiden as an adult despite his young age, became a topic of debate among criminal justice experts. Some argued that the severity of the crime justified adult prosecution, while others questioned whether someone so young could truly be held to the same standards as an adult defendant. The case also contributed to ongoing discussions about the role of social media and violent content in shaping young minds. Aiden's online activity, which included engagement with violent imagery and themes, raised questions about how easily troubled young people can access and be influenced by disturbing content. Today, Aiden Fucci remains incarcerated at Cross City Correctional Institution in Florida, serving his life sentence for the murder of Tristan Bailey. He will not be eligible for review of his sentence until 2046, when he will be 41 years old. Whether he will ever be released remains to be seen. But for now, he faces the prospect of spending most, if not all, of his remaining life behind bars. The Bailey family continues to honor Tristan's memory through their foundation work and advocacy efforts. They have found ways to channel their grief into positive action, working to prevent other families from experiencing the tragedy that befell them. While their loss remains immeasurable, they have found purpose in ensuring that Tristan's life, however brief, continues to have meaning and impact. The community of St. Johns County has largely healed from the trauma of Tristan's murder. Though the scars remain, parents are perhaps more vigilant, teachers more aware of warning signs, and neighbors more conscious of the need to look out for one another. The sense of innocence and security that was shattered by the crime has been replaced by a more mature understanding of the potential for evil to exist even in the safest seeming places. Tristan Bailey would have turned 17 this year. She would have been preparing for her senior year of high school, thinking about college applications, perhaps still cheering for her school team. Instead, she remains forever 13 in the memories of those who loved her. A bright smile, an infectious laugh, a life full of promise that was cut tragically short. Her story serves as a reminder of the preciousness of life and the importance of protecting our children, not just from external threats, but from the darkness that can sometimes emerge from within our own communities. It is a tragedy that defies easy explanation or comfortable resolution, but it is also a story that has prompted important conversations about youth violence, mental health, and community responsibility. In the end, perhaps the most fitting tribute to Tristan Bailey's memory is the commitment of those who loved her to ensure that her death was not in vain, that lessons were learned, that changes were made, and that other young lives might be saved. While nothing can bring her back or heal the wounds left by her loss, the determination to create positive change from such senseless tragedy represents the very best of human resilience in the face of incomprehensible evil. As we close this story, we remember Tristan not as a victim of violence, but as a young woman whose life, however brief, touched many others, and whose memory continues to inspire efforts to create a safer world for all children. May she rest in peace, and may her family find comfort in knowing that her story continues to make a difference in the lives of others. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. The high desert of California stretches endlessly in all directions, a landscape where secrets can be buried deep beneath the sandy soil and forgotten for years. In the small town of California City, nestled in the Mojave Desert about 100 miles north of Los Angeles, time moves slowly. It's the kind of place where everyone knows their neighbors, where missing persons cases don't happen often, and where a mother's worst nightmare would unfold over the course of more than a decade. This is the story of Desiree Nicole Thompson, a 30-year-old woman whose disappearance would baffle investigators for 10 long years, and whose case would ultimately be solved not through advanced forensic techniques or brilliant detective work, but through the guilty conscience of a killer who simply couldn't keep his terrible secret to himself. Desiree Thompson was 30 years old when she vanished from California City on January 7, 2012. Like many stories of missing persons, hers began not with fanfare or obvious danger signs, but with an ordinary day that would end in anything but ordinary circumstances. California City sits in Kern County, a sprawling desert community that was once envisioned as a master-planned city that would rival Los Angeles in size and scope. Instead, it became something different. A quiet, spread-out town where wide streets stretch between modest homes and empty lots, where the wind carries sand across lonely intersections, and where the vast distances between neighbors can make it easy for someone to disappear without immediate notice. Desiree's life, like many others in this desert community, had seen its share of struggles. She had an ex-husband named Edward Gibson, and their relationship had been marked by volatility and violence. Domestic disputes were not uncommon in their troubled marriage, and even after their separation, the specter of that turbulent relationship would later cast a shadow over the investigation into her disappearance. On that January day in 2012, Desiree Thompson encountered someone who would forever alter the trajectory of her life and the lives of everyone who loved her. According to what investigators would later piece together, she got into a pickup truck with a man named Jose William Lara. It was a decision that would cost her everything. Lara was not someone Desiree knew well. He was 50 years old at the time, a man living in a rental house on 86th Street in California City. What transpired in the hours following their meeting would remain a mystery for years, hidden beneath layers of sand and silence, in the backyard of that unremarkable desert home. When Desiree Thompson failed to return home, her absence didn't immediately raise alarm bells. In a town like California City, people sometimes disappear for days at a time, visiting friends in other cities, taking impromptu trips, or simply seeking space from their daily routines. But as hours turned into days, and days turned into weeks, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. Her mother, Sherry Smith, knew in her heart that her daughter was in trouble. A mother's instinct is a powerful thing, and Sherry felt the growing weight of anxiety as each day passed without word from Desiree. She contacted the California City Police Department, filing a missing person report, and beginning what would become a decade-long journey through the labyrinth of hope and despair that defines the families of the disappeared. The initial investigation followed standard procedures. Police canvassed the area where Desiree was last seen, interviewed friends and family members, and followed up on various leads and tips from the community. They looked closely at her relationship with her ex-husband, Edward Gibson. Given the history of domestic violence between them, in cases where women disappear under mysterious circumstances, statistics unfortunately point to intimate partners as the most likely perpetrators, and investigators naturally focused significant attention on this angle. But as weeks turned into months, and months stretched into years, the trail grew cold. There were no major breakthroughs, no crucial pieces of evidence, no witnesses who could provide definitive answers about what had happened to Desiree Thompson. Her case joined the thousands of others in law enforcement databases across the country. Missing persons whose fates remain unknown, whose families live in a perpetual state of limbo between hope and grief. Meanwhile, Jose William Lara continued living his life in California City. He eventually moved away from the house on 86th Street, leaving behind what he believed to be a perfectly buried secret. For years, he might have thought he had committed the perfect crime. Desiree's body lay hidden beneath the earth in his former backyard, and with each passing season, the physical evidence of his crimes seemed to become more remote and undetectable. But Jose Lara possessed a fatal flaw that would ultimately lead to his downfall. He couldn't keep quiet about what he had done. There's an old saying that two people can keep a secret if one of them is dead. But what happens when the person who committed the murder feels compelled to share the details of their crime? What drives someone to confess their darkest deeds to others, even when doing so puts them at risk of exposure and prosecution? For reasons that may never be fully understood, Jose William Lara began talking about what he had done to Desiree Thompson. Not to police, not to lawyers or counselors, but to acquaintances, people who would later be described in court documents as informants. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps it was a twisted form of bragging, or perhaps it was simply the psychological burden of carrying such a heavy secret so many years. The conversations reportedly took place over drinks, in casual settings where Lara felt comfortable enough to share horrific details about the night. Desiree Thompson died. According to documents that would later be filed in court, Lara described how he had invited Desiree to his house for beers. What started as what might have appeared to be a social encounter quickly turned deadly. Lara allegedly told these informants that during their time together something went wrong. The details he provided were chilling in their specificity. He claimed that he had bashed Desiree's head against a mini refrigerator in his home, and then stabbed her to death in his bedroom. The violence was sudden and brutal, transforming what may have begun as an ordinary evening into a scene of unimaginable horror. But perhaps even more disturbing than the killing itself was what came next. According to Lara's own alleged admissions, he then took Desiree's body and buried it in his backyard, covering the gravesite in an attempt to hide all evidence of the crime. He then continued living in that house, going about his daily routine while knowing that beneath the ground, just steps from his door, lay the remains of a woman whose family was desperately searching for answers. These conversations might have remained just that. Conversations between individuals with no particular loyalty to law enforcement or the pursuit of justice. But at some point, one or more of these informants decided that what they had heard was too important to keep secret. They contacted the California City Police Department and shared what Jose Lara had told them. By March 2022, it had been more than 10 years since Desiree Thompson had vanished. Her case had grown cold, her name had faded from local headlines, and the daily urgency of finding her had settled into the long, grinding ache of unresolved loss that her family had learned to carry. Then everything changed with a single phone call. The tip that came into the California City Police Department was specific and detailed. Informants told officers that Jose William Lara had been bragging about killing a woman who matched Desiree Thompson's description and burying her body in the backyard of 2031 86th Street in California City, the very address where Lara had been living at the time of Desiree's disappearance. For investigators, this was the kind of break that can revitalize a cold case. After years of following dead ends and pursuing leads that led nowhere, they finally had something concrete to investigate. The informant's accounts provided not just general allegations, but specific details about the location where Desiree's remains might be found. The decision to act on this information required careful consideration. Excavating someone's backyard is not something that law enforcement takes lightly. It requires resources, manpower, and the understanding that if nothing is found, an investigation may reach yet another dead end. But the details provided by the informants were compelling enough to warrant taking this significant step. In March 2022, investigators obtained the necessary warrants and descended upon the former home of Jose William Lara on 86th Street. The house had changed hands since Lara lived there, and the current occupants were likely unaware of the dark secret that may have been buried beneath their feet for the better part of a decade. What the investigators found that day would finally provide answers to questions that had haunted Desiree Thompson's family for more than 10 years. Hidden beneath layers of earth in the backyard, they discovered human remains. The skeletal remains were in a state consistent with having been buried for approximately a decade, matching the timeline of Desiree's disappearance. But the evidence didn't stop there. Inside the house in what had been the master bedroom during Laura's tenancy, investigators found blood evidence. Even after all those years, after whatever cleaning or renovation might have taken place, forensic experts were able to detect traces of what had happened in that room on the night Desiree Thompson died. The discovery sent shockwaves through the small community of California City and brought a mixture of closure and renewed grief to Desiree's family. After years of not knowing, of wondering if she might still be alive somewhere, they finally had their answer, but it was not the answer any parent hopes to receive. With human remains found in his former backyard, and blood evidence discovered in the bedroom of his former residence, Jose William Lara quickly became the prime suspect in Desiree Thompson's murder. The 61-year-old man was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, bringing to an end more than a decade of uncertainty about what had happened to Desiree. The arrest marked the beginning of a complex forensic investigation aimed at definitively connecting the remains found in the backyard to Desiree Thompson and linking Jose Lara to her death. Modern forensic science provides investigators with powerful tools for solving even decades-old crimes, and the Thompson case would require all of these resources. DNA analysis would play a crucial role in establishing the identity of the remains. After 10 years buried in desert soil, the skeletal remains required careful examination by forensic anthropologists and pathologists. The process of confirming that these were indeed Desiree's remains involved comparing DNA from the bones to DNA samples from her family members. Simultaneously, investigators worked to build a case connecting Lara to the crime. The blood evidence found in the master bedroom underwent extensive analysis. Forensic experts examined the blood spatter patterns, the location of the stains, and conducted DNA testing to determine whose blood had been shed in that room. The case that prosecutors began building relied heavily on forensic evidence, but also on the statements that Lara had allegedly made to informants over the years. These admissions, while not direct confidence to police, provided crucial details about how the crime had been committed and where the body had been disposed of. For Desiree's mother, Sherry Smith, the arrest brought a complex mix of emotions. After years of not knowing what had happened to her daughter, of holding on to hope that she might still be alive, the discovery of remains and the arrest of a suspect provided answers she had desperately sought. But those answers came with the devastating confirmation that Desiree was indeed dead, and had been dead for all the years her family had spent wondering and hoping. The case also raised questions about how many other similar crimes might remain unsolved, their perpetrators living freely because they had been more successful at keeping their secrets. Lara's apparent compulsion to talk about what he had done was ultimately his undoing, but it made investigators wonder how many other killers have managed to remain silent and avoid justice. When Jose William Lara's case finally went to trial in May 2023, more than 11 years had passed since Desiree Thompson's disappearance. The courtroom in Kern County became the setting for a legal proceeding that would determine whether justice could still be served after such a long delay, and whether the evidence gathered by investigators would be sufficient to convict Lara of first-degree murder. The prosecution's case relied on several key elements: the forensic evidence linking the remains found in Lara's former backyard to Desiree Thompson, the blood evidence found in the master bedroom of his former residence, and the statements he had allegedly made to informants describing in detail how he had killed and buried her. Prosecutors argued that the evidence painted a clear picture of what had happened on the night of January 7th. They contended that Lara had lured Desiree to his home, murdered her in a violent attack that included bashing her head against a mini refrigerator and stabbing her to death, and then buried her body in his backyard to hide the evidence of his crime. The defense faced the challenging task of creating reasonable doubt in the minds of jurors. Despite the physical evidence connecting their client to the crime scene and the victim's remains, they attempted to shift suspicion to other potential suspects, including Desiree's ex-husband, Edward Gibson, with whom she had a history of domestic violence. The defense strategy focused on the troubled relationship between Desiree and her ex-husband, arguing that Gibson's history of violence toward her made him a more likely suspect than Lara. They pointed to the couple's history of domestic disputes and suggested that investigators had focused too narrowly on Lara, while failing to adequately explore other possibilities. However, the prosecution had built a compelling case based on physical evidence and Lara's own alleged admissions. The forensic evidence placed Desiree's remains in Lara's former backyard, and her blood in his former bedroom. The statements he had allegedly made to informants provided details about the crime that only the perpetrator would know. Throughout the trial, Desiree's family members were present in the courtroom, finally seeing the legal system attempt to provide justice for their loved one. For Sherry Smith, watching the proceedings must have been both a relief and a renewed source of pain, as the details of her daughter's final moments were discussed in clinical legal terms. The trial also highlighted the role that community members had played in finally bringing the case to resolution. The informants who had listened to Lara's alleged confessions and then decided to report what they had heard to police had made it possible for investigators to finally locate Desiree's remains and build a case against her killer. After hearing the evidence presented by both sides, the jury in Jose William Lara's murder trial faced the responsibility of determining whether the prosecution had proven beyond a reasonable doubt that he was guilty of killing Desiree Thompson. The weight of more than a decade of unanswered questions rested on their decision. The jury deliberation was remarkably brief. After less than 30 minutes of discussion, the 12 jurors reached a unanimous verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder. The speed of their decision suggested that they found the evidence against Lara to be compelling and clear-cut, leaving little room for doubt about his guilt. The guilty verdict brought a sense of vindication to Desiree's family, and to the investigators who had worked on the case over the years. After more than 11 years of uncertainty, they finally had a legal determination that Jose William Lara was responsible for Desiree Thompson's death. The conviction represented not just justice for Desiree, but also validation for the family members who had never given up hope that her case would eventually be solved. Sherry Smith, who had spent more than a decade wondering what had happened to her daughter, finally had definitive answers and the knowledge that the person responsible would face consequences for his actions. In June 2023, Judge Michael G. Bush sentenced Jose William Lara to 25 years to life in prison. The sentence reflected the severity of the crime and ensured that Lara, who was 61 years old at the time of his conviction, would likely spend the remainder of his life behind bars. During the sentencing hearing, several of Desiree's family members had the opportunity to read victim impact statements, sharing with the court how her death had affected their lives and their feelings about finally seeing justice served. These statements provided a human dimension to a case that had been reduced to forensic evidence and legal arguments, reminding everyone present that behind the clinical details of the investigation was a real person whose life had been cut short and whose family had suffered immeasurably. The case of Desiree Thompson serves as a reminder that justice, while sometimes delayed, can still be achieved even years after a crime has been committed. Advances in forensic science, combined with the dedication of law enforcement officers and the courage of community members willing to come forward with information, can breathe new life into cold cases that might otherwise remain forever unsolved. The resolution of Desiree Thompson's case after more than a decade brings up profound questions about justice, closure, and the nature of truth. For her family, the conviction of Jose William Lara provided answers they had desperately sought, but it also forced them to confront the reality that Desiree had been dead for all the years they had held on to hope that she might still be alive. The case also highlights the sometimes random nature of how cold cases get solved. It wasn't advanced forensic techniques or brilliant detective work that initially broke the case open. It was Jose Lara's inability to keep his terrible secret to himself. His decision to share details of the crime with others, perhaps driven by guilt or a need to confess, ultimately led to his downfall and provided the key that unlocked more than a decade of mystery. This aspect of the case raises troubling questions about how many other similar crimes remain unsolved, simply because their perpetrators have been more successful at keeping quiet. How many families are still waiting for answers about missing loved ones whose killers have managed to remain silent about their crimes? The informants who ultimately came forward with information about Lara's alleged confessions played a crucial role in solving the case. But their decision to report what they had heard also highlights the complex social dynamics that surround knowledge of criminal activity. These individuals had to weigh their personal relationships and potential risks against their civic duty to help solve a crime and provide closure to a grieving family. For the law enforcement officers who worked on the case over the years, Lara's conviction represented vindication for their persistent efforts to solve what had become a cold case. Detective work on missing persons cases requires a particular kind of dedication, as investigators must continue pursuing leads and following up on tips, even when months or years pass without significant progress. The case also demonstrates the importance of maintaining hope in seemingly hopeless situations. Desiree's family never stopped believing that someday they would learn what had happened to her, and their persistence in keeping her case in the public eye may have contributed to the eventual breakthrough that led to the discovery of her remains. The physical location where Desiree was found, buried in the backyard of a modest home in the California desert, speaks to the ordinary settings where extraordinary crimes can occur. The house on 86th Street looked like any other residence in California City, giving no outward indication of the terrible secret hidden beneath its sandy soil. As we reach the end of this long and complex story, it's important to remember that beyond all the forensic evidence, legal proceedings, and investigative techniques, at its heart, this is the story of a human being whose life was cut short by violence. Desiree Nicole Thompson was 30 years old when she died. A daughter, a woman with her own hopes, dreams, fears, and aspirations. The decade that passed between her death and the discovery of her remains represents 10 years of missed birthdays, holidays without her presence, and countless moments when her family wondered where she was and whether she was safe. For her mother, Sherry Smith, those were 10 years of living in the liminal space between hope and despair, never quite able to grieve fully because she didn't know for certain what had happened to her daughter. The resolution of Desiree's case provides a form of closure, but it's important to understand that legal justice and emotional healing are not the same thing. While Jose William Lara's conviction ensures that he will face consequences for his actions, it cannot bring Desiree back or erase the years of uncertainty and pain her family endured. The case also serves as a reminder of the thousands of other families across the country who are still waiting for answers about their missing loved ones. According to the National Crime Information Center, there are tens of thousands of active missing person cases in the United States at any given time. Behind each of those statistics is a family dealing with the same kind of uncertainty and grief that Desiree's family experienced for more than a decade. In the quiet desert town of California City, life continues much as it always has. The wide streets still stretch between modest homes and empty lots. The wind still carries sand across lonely intersections, and the vast distances between neighbors still make it possible for secrets to be hidden for years. But perhaps now there's a greater awareness that even in this peaceful-seeming community, terrible crimes can occur, and that justice, while sometimes delayed, can still eventually be served. The house on 86th Street where Desiree Thompson spent her final moments and where her body lay hidden for 10 years now stands as a silent testament to both human cruelty and human resilience. It reminds us that behind the facade of ordinary suburban life, extraordinary dramas of life and death can unfold, leaving lasting scars on families and communities. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps take a moment to remember Desiree Thompson, not as a victim or a case study, but as a person whose life had value and meaning, whose absence left a hole in the lives of those who loved her, and whose story serves as a reminder of both the darkness that humans are capable of, and the persistence of those who refuse to let injustice go unanswered. In the end, Desiree's story is one of justice delayed but not denied, of secrets that couldn't remain buried forever, and of a family's love that endured through more than a decade of uncertainty and pain. While her life was cut tragically short, her memory lives on, and her case serves as a beacon of hope for other families still searching for answers about their missing loved ones. The desert keeps its secrets well, but sometimes, just sometimes, the truth finds a way to surface, bringing with it both pain and peace, questions and answers, endings and new beginnings. In the case of Desiree Nicole Thompson, that truth took more than 10 years to emerge, but when it finally did, it ensured that a killer would face justice and a family would finally know what had happened to someone they loved. Rest in peace, Desiree. Your story has been told, your killer has been caught, and your memory will not be forgotten. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.